English translation 912th contact. Monday, 2nd June 2025, 15:17 hours.
Excuse me, I did not mean to be unfriendly. It was just that I was a bit stressed because I still had to sort out some invoices for Eva and Kunio, as well as a fax I had to beam off to the printing press. Sometimes everything comes together at the same time. Plus, Eva was next door in her office, and the door to it was open. She certainly would not have bitten you if she had come in. She really is not biting. Excuse me, though, for reacting so harshly, and that is probably why you left so quickly. But welcome back now, my friend.
You are also welcome, Edward. Do not reproach yourself. It probably would not have happened if I had been more careful, and I really should have been, even if I had also called you here beforehand and thought you were alone in your workroom. And Eva, well, a brief encounter would not have been a disaster, but it had unintentionally violated our directives due to carelessness on my part.
That would not have been so bad, but we should not think about that now because nothing happened.
That is so, but I have realized that I really have to be more careful. But why I am coming here today is because in addition, regarding the last 2 attacks against you, what we have been doing but you should not talk about it openly, because
I already suspected something like that, and not saying anything about it is probably the only correct thing to do.
Most certainly, Edward. And I know that you can remain silent, because my grandfather explicitly mentioned this in his annals, and mentioned that you were also more likely to close the gate of life behind you than to say a single word more than your promise would allow. That is why you also decided on the procedure of blocking all knowledge concerning in your consciousness in such a way that with hypnosis and even with hard violence, nothing can ever get out that you know, but which you are supposed to conceal. But this is not to be mentioned explicitly all the time, whereas other things would be interesting to be explained, because through this, for example, many misconceptions could be uncovered and corrected as nonsense in many Earth humans, such as, for example, as I could read from my grandfather's annals that you carried the Koh-i-Noor, which was supposedly burdened with an evil curse, with you for 4 days, which was hidden in a turban, which my grandfather then handed over to the Persian Shah Nader Afshar when you were with him.
I have not thought about that for a long time, but now that you mention it, I remember it again. It was around the year 1740 or so, and the turban was a gift with the precious stone sewn into it, which, it was said, had been found around 5,000 years earlier, and had only brought misfortune and death to those who wore it.
Bermunda and I investigated this legend or curse, but we were unable to find anything that could confirm the truth of this alleged curse. Through this research, Bermunda, Florina, and Jana and I have become more deeply interested in the religions that prevail among Earth humans. We also know from Sim, Yase, and Ptah that you were very interested in religions from an adolescent age, and that you learnt a lot from Pastor Zimmerman in Bulach, who accepted you as a non-baptized and non-confirmed person and always stood by you. My grandfather Sfath and he together also taught you in this regard, as you then converted to various denominations of your own accord and interest during your life in order to learn a lot about how and what they hold in terms of faith and tradition, etc. You even went to as a boy. You even taught children Sunday school in several times as a boy. If you can tell me something about what the religions contain, how you learnt it, I will register the whole thing here so that I can also pass it on to the interested 3.
Of course I can, but that will take some time. It is probably about explaining something fundamental.
That is correct, because we are interested and really. However, it is incomprehensible to all of us that something unprovable and false is simply accepted as a belief and not grounded in the truth in order to evolve according to it and acquire valuable knowledge.
That is effectively incomprehensible and also does not make sense to me. Because understanding and reason are already given to the embryo through the drawing in of the life energy of creation on the 21st day after conception, But the fact that a child then becomes so stupid and adheres to a belief as a result of indoctrination is incomprehensible to me. This is because, as Svath explained to me, a child as young as 2 years old is already capable of consciously using its intellect and reason, and can therefore also make independent decisions about what is correct and what is not. And I know that this is true, and I experienced it myself when, as a 2.5-year-old, I left home and walked some 20 or 23 kilometers, sometimes on carts to Zurich, where I was seen by the cart driver Nussli, who knew me at Stauffacherplatz, picked me up, and brought me back to Bulach. Back then, when I was about 2 years old, I started to climb into the big toolbox underneath the wagon of the carter Breitenstein and ride along when he had to take goods to the spinning mill or pick them up there. Well, that was then. But the fact that human beings as children simply let themselves be duped into believing by sheer lies and fantasies, etc., usually by their parents, and as adult human beings simply continue to believe the lies and all the imbecility of what they have been indoctrinated with, effectively corresponds to absolute low intelligence and stupidity, as well as a stupidly bogus way of thinking, and that is no longer plausible to me. Nothing more can be said about this, because non-thinking and believing has obviously become so ingrained in most Earth humans that clear and free self-thinking has become torture for them and can no longer be reversed, or only with great difficulty.
What you say is also recorded in my grandfather's annals, because he really did write down everything that was of importance. And the fact that many Earth humans unfortunately only believe instead of thinking for themselves is something I have learnt to understand. Because since I began to study religions, I have realized that this is the greatest disaster for Earth humans and has brought strife, hatred, war, and discord since time immemorial.
Which you are absolutely right about, because the majority of Earthlings are devoid of any clear mind and reason, which is why the murderous military and NATO organizations and guerrilla groups, etc., also exist, spreading fear and terror, as well as mass death and destruction. That is why there is also constant agitation for war, because the morbid and incompetent idiots of governments, in cowardly fear and cowardice, constantly fantasize about warlike attacks, and therefore expect them. This instead of talking to each other reasonably and settling disputes through understanding and reason. But if there is a lack of understanding and reason, then nothing sensible can be thought, and then all hope and malt is lost. And so it is with the majority of humanity, not only with the majority of those in power, and so they have fallen into indifference and complete irresponsibility. Unfortunately, nothing can be done about this because human beings do not want to be taught. But those who do are few and far between, so there is only a minority of people in the world who think and act correctly. But back to your request, so be it, but it really takes time, and I can only explain what comes to my mind at the moment. I can also access various information from the internet and refresh my memory. So I cannot explain everything in detail, but
I also do not expect you to.
good, but knowing myself, I will, if necessary, have to give personal explanations here and there, because it will just be necessary. But then I want to say this. Here, I still have this letter with various questions that you should read.
What do you want to answer or say to these questions?
I know they fall under my silence, because I have already made a vow to your grandfather Svath. That is why I will answer the questions in order, and simply leave out the ones I am not allowed to answer. The first question, whether you play R and have robots, I can answer with no, as I'm sure you can confirm, because even when I was together with your grandfather Svath, you already had androids that were so similar to humans, and also looked so different in terms of physiognomy, that they were indistinguishable from us humanoids on Earth. And these,
which is and will be preserved.
of course, that should be clear, although I suppose there have been innovations since then. But good, the question goes on to the UFO-nauts, as I want to call these foreigners, which I have never said much about, if anything. But now I want to explain why I came up with nautic, namely because this term, which comes from ancient Greek, actually simply meant leadership, as I found out together with Svath. In the end, This was remodeled as guiding a ship, and since the unknown flying objects have been called UFOs since the last century, but were already called airships thousands of years ago, because they were already flying around in the earthly airspace at that time, I call the airship guides UFO nauts. The fact that the term nautic, which was originally used in ancient Greek to mean guiding and directing, has been transformed into guiding a ship, and is also understood as such today, is therefore based on a conceptual linguistic distortion. I know from my modern Greek, which I learned because I married a Greek woman, that today leadership is used with different terms for different things. For example, in relation to management, administration, party leadership, organizational leadership, leadership of human beings and groups of human beings, and leadership in general, etc. So there are different terms for different things, which is a bit confusing, I think. But now I want to say that Svath and I am only saying this to you because, and I also saw and experienced various foreigners and androids with the strangers in the 1940s. Also when traveling back to early times together with Svath, and dressed in protective suits that made us invisible to the UFOnauts. However, these were of a completely different kind to those of you, the Plejaren, and there were also differences in the foreigners themselves. Although I would like to say that some of them were humanoids, some were humanoid, and some only remotely resembled humans due to their extremities. The androids I saw were all not primitive robots, but corresponded to very futuristic electronics, which, like your androids, looked human-like or human-like in appearance, and had a wide variety of facial features, and were practically indistinguishable from human beings. Others, however, were all similar, so to speak, and therefore not different in terms of physiognomy, but the same, which is why it could be seen that these were futuristic electronic androids. By which I mean the electronics of which they were made, which were far superior to the primitive electronics of Earthlings today, and also are today. In addition, there were also very alien life forms in androids, whereby the real life forms themselves were not humanoid-like, and therefore not like human beings from Earth or similar. Svath explained to me that this highly developed futuristic technology of electronics already existed in early times, many millions of years ago, but he used a different term which I have forgotten. So the foreigners were already here on Earth thousands of years ago, just as such androids of the foreigners also came to Earth independently and worked here. They were independent thinkers, workers, and even capable of repairing and duplicating themselves. Something that is also probably the case today and also applies to your androids, as I know from Simyase and Pa. That is all I have to say about the question of UFOs and robots. I do not want to say any more about it because I do not feel like revealing any more. So I will also not answer any further questions in this regard. The question here about crop circles, I already said a few things about that last time, but this time I want to say something more detailed about it. There were already questions about this in the 1970s. To which I replied that Earthlings were faking it back then, not only with regard to crop circles, but also with regard to alleged abductions by extraterrestrials. Well, Simyase advised me back then not to explain too much about this, which I also did. But now I think that something more can and should be explained in this regard today. Firstly, that it largely stopped at that time with the fact that crop circles were imitated by Earthlings with footboards and were therefore faked. This was partly done by jokers, to make the whole thing laughable, or by idiots who wanted to deceive people interested in UFOs or crop circles. But there were also those who were secretly employed by governments for a fee, in the hope that everything about crop circles would be made so ridiculous that the general public would succumb to it. However, this was a miscalculation, because the majority of the crop circles were not made falsely by Earthlings, but by namely vibrationally by, as Svath already explained to me in the 1940s, when we saw such crop circles centuries ago while traveling in the past, and I wanted to know how they came about. However, I should remain silent and not talk about what the connections between these crop circles actually are. I may say, however, that they are caused by vibrations, namely by which I will call electromagnetic swinging waves, because I knew of no other name for them, as the futuristic does not yet have an earthly linguistic name. Of course, this does not explain the effective form of futuristic energy, but human beings can visualize electromagnetic swinging waves. The images of crop circles are created within a few seconds or minutes, which in many cases not even whole groups of Earthlings could achieve in hours. As for the questions regarding abductions by extraterrestrials and UFOs of foreigners, I should also keep quiet about this, which, to be honest, I am also not very interested in and want nothing to do with. As for the abductions of Earthlings by extraterrestrials, I can at least say that some of them have really taken place and effectively correspond to the truth, while others are just ludicrous claims made for the sake of prestige, etc., while others correspond to nightmares, fantasies, or fear fantasies, as Sim Yase and I were able to discover in the 1970s. I have not bothered about that since then and have no interest in it. All in all, I do not really care about these things, the UFOs, abductions, crop circles and animal mutilations, etc. by extraterrestrials, which is why I do not worry about them, because the whole thing has nothing to do with you playerin, just as it has nothing to do with the teaching I have to spread. When Asket and Sim Yase made circles in the grass, precisely by swinging waves of... It was just as much for the sake of demonstration as when a layer of ice about 10 centimeters thick and 2 meters in diameter was melted away in a few minutes in the car park. As far as the question of sanctions is concerned, I think they are idiotic, because sanctions against a country are really only directed against a people, because they only affect and penalize them, but not those in power because they do not care about them, and they are not affected by them. And as for the other thing that is written there, I have to say that I am neither a clairvoyant nor a prophet, because my knowledge is not of this kind, but everything comes from traveling in the future and in the past with Svath, your grandfather. And as far as my photos are concerned, I had them in safekeeping with, who sold a large number of them to Germany, some of which I was then able to buy back as copies for 10 marks apiece. However, I had previously given many of the originals to the photographer in the Rhine Valley, who was supposed to organize them for me in the form of a register, but the man forged them together with 2 and attached long threads to them, as if they had been models, and hung them up. Many of these photos were then distributed worldwide. So unfortunately, all these were distributed worldwide. In addition, many were stolen from me, and some were also burnt by, but some were rescued, in order to accuse me of being a fake. This, just as the photographer Sorge and Mendrisio also falsified some of my photographs and conjured them into pictures of Mendrisio, as if Sim Yase had flown around there with her beam ship. He published these falsifications in a pocket diary. He and his girlfriend Mara were on holiday with my daughter and my then relative, and Sorge and were plotting all kinds of ubles against me in order to, well, there were many originals of the photos. I was allowed to take more than 3,000 in total, and Sim Yase kept about half of the original photos and films with him, some of which Piero was later able to use when he made the photo books. And this question here about how you play and provide yourselves with fresh vegetables when you are traveling through space and time, I may well say that this is no secret. Because even in your grandfather Svath's time, I saw in Playaran spaceships that vegetables were planted in these spacecraft and that fresh vegetables were always available. And as it was explained to me at the time, I remember it clearly. It was said that these vegetables were vital, that the human beings, the crews of the spacecraft, had fresh vegetables for food because the food they carried with them was not sufficient for a long time.
That is indeed the case, because over a long period of time, Yubel health complaints arise.
Exactly, I was also told that at the time. It was also very interesting for me to see how the vegetables were planted in the large rooms, namely around vertical pipes about 4 meters high and 40 or 50 centimeters in diameter, in which there were openings at the sides where plants could be placed or seeds inserted, which then grew. There was some kind of device in the pipes that supplied the necessary water, etc. But enough of that. Because as far as these last questions here are concerned, I also have to keep quiet about them, although I have already promised Svath that I will never say anything about them. The question here about the Moon series also falls under this. And I also think that the Earthlings who are researching this is their business, and that they should not be told things and things worth knowing.
Please tell me more about that, but it may come later. I have read a lot in my grandfather's annals and also found a lot of valuable things in his estate, but unfortunately my time is always short when I can deal with these records and so on. All that material is a lot, because my grandfather meticulously recorded the events of every single day from the time you were conceived until the day he departed from Earth.
I am happy to tell you some of the things I remember, and I know that Svath wrote everything down day by day. But now I still have this. As you know, sometimes figures appear here, behind the house in front of my office window, as well as on the other side of the house, which Bridget and I have also seen together. But this often happens in front of the house, and the figures often come right up to the entrance. Then, however, these figures suddenly disappear, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Each time, the motion detectors also switch on the light, which of course goes out again after a few minutes. But now comes the interesting part, namely that after I had twice memorized the exact time when the figures appeared, Michael and I checked the surveillance cameras. It turned out that the green control strip in the places where the figures were supposed to appear was simply black, although every movement was indicated by the color yellow. Before and after the figures appeared, the green strip showed the clear movements with a yellow color. But when the figures appeared, no recording was made and everything was black, whereas normally everything remains green when there is no movement.
That is known to me, for Ptah already told me about it. For he also observed the same thing together with you, as did Bridget. Consequently, Arlian with his co-workers grounded the whole thing and ascertained but what you shall not name.
Interesting, then.
Exactly. And besides, you know that the center is being closely monitored, and as well as by and by.
Of course, which is denied when it is mentioned, as is also the fact that it is believed that we are addicted to being blind and did not know that.
This blandness, as you say, is indeed true as we realized ourselves.
The majority of Earthlings' rulers seem to be bland, especially those of Germany, because apparently they still do not realize that the ex-chancellor of Germany, Merkel, is to blame for the fact that human beings worldwide are fleeing their poor homelands, running away to the industrialized countries in the north of the planet and hoping that they will have it better there. Thousands die miserably on the way, mostly by drowning, and all because Merkel has irresponsibly proclaimed the welcome culture. However, she is not blamed for this, and the fact that it has caused a global catastrophe, but is praised for this and that. But those governments that are mentally Nazi in their mindset and thus have fantasies of war in their thoughts, nothing but cowardly fear and unreasonableness, as well as absolutely pathological illusory thinking. Wrong decisions and partisanship, idiotic speechifying, and neither little understanding nor reason can be expected from them. And that is the case with the majority of rulers around the world, against whom all righteous people in state leadership have no chance. This is also the case in Switzerland, as I unfortunately have to mention, especially by the traitors who make a mockery of our national neutrality and act against the Constitution. For example, by also trampling on the rights of the people and negotiating and concluding treaties with the EU dictatorship without consulting the people. But nothing good and correct can effectively be expected from such rulers. On the contrary, only that they deny everything and may even take legal action against you if you tell the truth. But these female and male idiot elements cannot even think enough to betray themselves and prove that everything that is said about them is true. And while I am at it, I wonder and ask myself how long it will be before someone in power around the world finally blurts out that various European governments have paid and are paying certain persons from the people with taxpayers' money to organize public demonstrations in certain places and have them carried out. I also wonder how long it will take in Germany for people to realize that the idiotic supply of weapons to the fanatical warmongering Zelensky, who, in his fanatical war mania, does not want peace and does everything to ensure that it can continue, by the Nazi-minded people. The war-mindedness of the majority of the government and the like-minded part of the people still persists. The whole of this deviant attitude and the action of supplying weapons has completely changed the Russian people's opinion of Russia, namely for the worse and even to hatred against Germany and its people. Whereas at first there was respect and esteem for the German people for having so diligently and righteously rebuilt the destroyed country and economy, etc., in a very short time after the end of the last World War, and for also making everything flourish and thus gaining the respect of the whole world, this has now turned into the opposite. In such a way that the Russian people have now revised their good opinion, and it has changed drastically. Something that is not good, and which I should not say, but stink is the earthling's profession and passion. Also when, as in this matter, that is the conclusion of what Bermunda and I saw and recognized when we met 3 weeks ago. But a huge stink is also brewing in America itself, because the so-called friendship of convenience between the dictator President Trump and the fool Musk is running crookedly and very unpleasantly, as you have noticed, as you said. And his supporters obviously do not realize that Trump is a dictator. They are probably so blind in their low intelligence that they do not realize that the whole country and its people are being dictatorized into absolute misery. At the same time, it is also the case that the whole world looks the other way and does nothing when it comes to environmental protection, because everything is being done to make a mess of the earth. This is the case in America, for example, where the government pack in charge does nothing, by which I mean the like-minded elements surrounding the dictator Trump, who were obviously already at work earlier and authorized that in California and under the patronage of Governor Arnie Schwarzenegger, who is actually Austrian, an insanely huge car tire waste depot was allowed to be built in the Mojave Desert, which is probably the largest in the world and might even make a mess of the desert. Of course, neither the American people nor the world population know anything about this. But it really exists, as I was able to see for myself when I was with Arleon. But I had to keep quiet about it, which also applies in the future, which is why I was also not allowed to call up and record a report of the conversation. Well, the even bigger trouble than the camp regarding the tire waste is going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip, where the mass murderer Netanyahu, who wields the genocide and murder scepter like a second Hitler, and also the warmongering Zelensky in Ukraine, whose murderous war crimes are hailed as heroic deeds in all the media, are given all the right to do so. This, while Putin and Russia are being partisanly stomped into the ground, with not only Israel's mass murderers and all of its allies being praised for all of the war crimes, but also Zelensky in equal measure. And the fact that it is they, with America in the background, who are on the verge of provoking a further and terrifying world war, which could quickly degenerate into nuclear energy or nuclear forms, does not bother the idiots of various governments at all, because they are incapable of thinking and foresight. In this respect, all the crazy Nazi-hungry governments of Germany, Israel, France, and the EU dictatorship as well as America, and some of their misguided people, lowly intelligent and simple-minded, are greedy for power and revenge and are working diligently, especially Netanyahu in the Middle East and with America behind him, to drag their archenemy, namely Persia, into a war and, as they say, to unleash the devil. Something that could quickly lead to an unprecedented world conflagration and then pose a nuclear threat, because AI or artificial intelligence is now also involved. Putin cannot be praised to the skies, because he too is an element of war mania and mass murder, but in contrast to America's headsick and insane dictator Trump, as well as the completely fanatical and irresponsible, unscrupulous mass murderers and warmongering Zelensky and Netanyahu, Putin is, so to speak, an insane orphan who may have started the Ukraine war, but is so clueless that he cannot see what the future really holds. The Hitler-like Netanyahu, it must be said in particular, is the greatest danger of effectively triggering a vicious world conflagration, just as he is already the greatest danger for the Middle East. That, as in Germany, France, England, and in the EU dictatorship, the top leaders are so deluded and also so deluded in their religious beliefs that they have lost absolute control over reality as Nazi thinkers, which particularly affects the Chancellor in Germany, the President in France, and the President of the European Commission in the EU dictatorship, and also their henchmen who support and collaborate with them. And as usual, the victims will not be the criminal and all the irresponsible state leaders and the murdering military, but the people in all the countries affected by war. That will be the case in Persia, as it already is in Gaza, Ukraine, and Russia. It has been the case in Gaza in particular for some time, where the mass murderer Netanyahu is spreading death and destruction, as he will do in Persia, and will be praised by like-minded murderers and lunatics from the governments of various European countries. In the background with America and its crazy and unaccountable dictator Trump and his lunatic consorts. That is what needs to be said, and what will have dire consequences if these war idiots and those parts of the like-minded people who are all neo-Nazis are not finally stopped. If they combine war, partisanship, and possibly revenge and retribution in their minds. I think I have said everything that needs to be said clearly and unambiguously. But now I want to finish what was discussed earlier. Well, the whole thing about talismans and amulets and curses and lucky charms, etc. is, in my opinion, just a legend based on fantasies anyway. To my knowledge and understanding, as I have learnt from Svath's experiments, it is all nonsense. The whole thing is the same with talismans and amulets, etc. They naturally, like all matter of any kind, have a natural vibration and therefore a certain amount of energy, which under certain circumstances, even if tiny, is still measurable. Talismans and amulets are nothing more than gimmicks, gadgets, or simply things that are usually worshipped and also worn as jewelry by human beings as a result of a delusion of faith. In and of themselves, these appendages are completely harmless and powerless as delusional bringers of luck or repellents of misfortune, etc., and also as carriers of escape and bringers of death, because they are effectively just things that are worn, carried, dragged around, or hoarded by human beings as a result of their belief or delusion. In their delusional belief, or rather through it and through their illusory thoughts in this regard, they then create what they delusionally hope or fear from their talisman amulet. So the same thing happens as when people believe in a god from whom they beg for help, or I know what, whereby human beings then unconsciously help themselves and get what they hope for and delusionally believe that their imaginary god has helped them, but which they have worked for themselves. And it is also the same with regard to what human beings hope for from a talisman and amulet. Namely, that they create what they hope for themselves and believe in their delusion that the talisman or amulet fulfills everything for them. Delusional belief alone, according to its intensity, is therefore the decisive factor in the fact that the human being, in his delusion, unknowingly endeavors and mobilizes everything to ensure that his begging, his wish and his hope, etc., are fulfilled, namely by unconsciously doing everything to ensure that everything turns out as he imagines it will. Now, if it is the case that a thing, object, instrument or apparatus, etc., harbors an energy and power that can be consciously used for something specific or causes something specific, then it is inevitable and necessary that this apparatus or instrument contains a battery that must first be charged with energy by an energy donor, after which energy can be used. But the energy of the battery is used up and must be recharged. So the stored energy cannot be permanent, but only available for a short time in such a way that it needs to be recharged again. So that corresponds to what I had to say. And if I now turn to the religions and explain to you what I can think of about the individual ones at the moment, it will not happen in a flash. It will take time.
I understand that. And that is not so important, because I have enough time today, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, so I can come here today, tomorrow, and then the day after tomorrow, all day. And that is to listen to your explanations as well as to dictate.
Then there is no problem. So if I can start, and I want to do that by addressing Christianity first, which is represented here in Europe, consequently I do not really have to say much. If I remember some expressions or terms for the other religions, then I will explain them, although I may have to check how they are spelt if you dictate them to me in the next few days, but that will not matter much. The following, then?
Christianity in the so-called Christian world. It is the Christ cross that is considered the most important symbol of believing Christians. And it is worshipped as a shrine, so to speak, because it is supposed to remind us of the death of Jesus on the cross, who was never called that, because his real name was Emmanuel. There is also the Alpha and Omega. Alpha and Omega, which represents the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, symbolizing the beginning and the end, and thus also the all-embracing. That is to say, according to the Christian faith, God, but in particular Christ, as the first and the last. Believers in Christ claim, especially the Catholic Pope, the entire clergy, the priests and preachers of the Protestants, Catholics and various sects, that the cross is said to have had a redeeming effect through the suffering and death of the crucified one, which simply corresponds to a lie. The Christ cross is said to be both a sign of Christ himself and also a strong symbol of the faith of believers in Christ. Christianity is currently around 2030 years old since its falsely invented origin by the inventors of Christianity, whereby it is said to have developed from Judaism, which, however, also corresponds to a lie, because Emmanuel was probably the son of a Jewess and a Jew, but he did not live according to a faith and was therefore not a believer. Because he taught Nicodemus teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, which he had learnt through the initiative of a Pleiadian teacher. The impetus for this came from the Pleiadian Gabriel, when Emmanuel from Nazareth recognized the truth in Nicodemus' teaching and declared himself ready to learn and spread it. He may have been born Jewish, but he recognized that the Jewish faith, like every other faith, was also fundamentally wrong, because he was able to understand that only conscious self-thinking was correct, and that this was how human beings achieved true self-reliance, inner independence and inner freedom, and were not simply a religious apostate. He also learned and then taught freedom and the great and far-reaching knowledge that began to grow in him through the teaching and to guide his life in a valuable way. This alone shows the lie that is mainly spread by all those who claim that Emmanuel was faithful and believed in God from the bottom of his heart. The Catholic Church, in particular, Lugnerish misleads. There is only one true religion. God himself has given the human being the way of faith, which is serving him in Christ, so that he can be saved and blessed without thinking. Thus, the central element of the Christian faith is hammered into human beings with an unashamed lie: you must believe. Emmanuel, aka Jesus, is accused by the Christian religion of the lewd of being executed as a political insurrectionist, although the whole political thing was just that Pontius Pilate allowed the crucifixion against his will, because that was what the scholars of the Jews of the time wanted, who played an important role in Jewish society and had great influence and might as well as different meanings and functions, despite the occupation of Israel by the Romans. They were all not only intellectuals of the time, but also leaders and teachers, as well as powerful interpreters of the Jewish religion and laws. This is actually what I have to explain in a wise way about Christianity, behind which more evil and other negative things are hidden than the believers in Christ are also capable of realizing. But to find this out, let the believers in Christ do it themselves, if one day they feel able to do so and to find out and experience the full evil truth. More, I think, is probably not to be said, because since we are in so-called Christian countries, everything should actually be known. And I can explain to you all, one by one, what you want to know about this religion. I will now start with Islam, where I was given the name Muhammad Abdullah, in Karachi, and I will look for the scriptural document to show you. I was also given names in all other religions and was then also called this for many years in accordance with these. Unfortunately, however, I have no proof of this, because I was given the names just like that, so I only have one document relating to Muhammad Abdullah. But now what I want to say about Islam, but, as I said, only in bits and pieces, something that comes to my mind at the moment, as I will also do with the other religions. Islam. What I want to explain in this regard is, Islam is a religion that actually traces back to a Judaic and Christian origin, but is already founded on an Abrahamic teaching based on monotheistic roots, which teaches that there was only one God, Allah, and that Muhammad was the last messenger of Allah. Shahada is the Islamic profession of faith, namely the first of the 5 pillars of Islam, which reads, I testify that there is no God but God, and I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of God." Saying this is an important step in joining Islam. The human being who says this with conviction is immediately considered a Muslim, even if he is a disbeliever. The believer often adds Allahu Akbar, God is great, God is greatest. Of course, this is only an assumption made by believers and is therefore seen as an entry into the Islamic circle. The belief of Islam wants human beings on earth to lead their lives in such a way that they find happiness and inner peace in the hereafter. It is believed that human beings can be offered solutions to all problems through Islam. Love, equality, and tolerance are mentioned as important elements in Islam. For believers in Islam, the main symbol is the crescent moon with star. Crescent moon in Arabic equals hilal, whereby the narrow crescent moon is very important in Islam because the Islamic year is aligned with the lunar calendar. The new moon crescent with star is depicted on a red background and is mainly a symbol of Sunni Islam. The sword of Allah, also known as Zulfikar, and the identifying symbol of the Alevis, with its double point, is also a symbol of Islam that is considered sacred by the Shiites. It is a sword that is considered a symbol of divine leadership, justice, and might, especially in the Shiite tradition. It is attributed to a Caliph Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is considered important. The main symbol of Islam is the crescent moon Arabic, hilal, with a star on a red background, although this symbol is anchored in Sunni Islam. In general, there are of course other Islamic symbols, namely those that are commonly used in Islam and of course also have a positive meaning. These include, for example, the crescent and star, the Kaaba in Mecca, and the color green. Islam is the world's second largest religion with around 2.5 billion followers Muslims, which makes up around a quarter of the world's population. The Sunnis are the largest denomination in Islam, with around 80 to 90% believers worldwide. They are also referred to as Al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which means people of the Sunnah and the community, and as a religious community, they are followers of the prophetic tradition. They also believe that they, like all Islamic faith groups, except the Shia Rafidis, are followers of the caliphate of Caliph Abu Bakr, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Uthman ibn Affan. The believers are followers of the prophetic Sunnah and those who follow it, but are neither divisive nor sectarian. It should also be said that all intoxicants are forbidden in Islam, that is to say, alcohol and drugs of all kinds, as described in the Quran. The Sunnis and Shiites, along with other groups, are the two largest denominations in Islam. The Shiites make up around 15% of Islam and believe that the succession of Muhammad and the leadership of the religious community are different from the way they are perceived. In Islam, the number 77 is important, as it signifies the seventh heaven for the believers, which is understood to be the place of final enlightenment and into which the Kunda Muhammad is said to have entered. What else needs to be said? In Islam, all good signs and/or omens are acceptable and in order, because for the believers they mean trust in Allah, according to which everything can only be good. However, this is not the case with IS, which is an abbreviation for Islamic State. Consequently, nothing good can be said of it, which also applies to the equally criminal murderous organization Al-Qaeda, as evidenced by the murderous act that was carried out in 2001 and concerned the tower attack, which was directed against the World Trade Center in New York and destroyed it. It is true that these murderous groups are fanatical criminal organizations that claim to be made up of members who believe in Islam. In reality, however, the Islamic State is a group of political murderers whose aim is to take might in Iraq and Syria and enforce fanatical, strict Islamic rules there. They are therefore also calling on all followers of non-Islamic religions to leave Iraq, otherwise they will be threatened with violence and murder. All the members of this criminal group are politically misguided, as is equally true for the members of Al-Qaeda, whose ultimate strategic goal is to fanatically establish a Sunni territorial fundamentalist ideology and rule. To this end, the interests and systems of the Western states are fought against, among other things, in order to achieve this crazy goal. Al-Qaeda is therefore nothing other than IS, a murderous organization on a par with NATO and any regular army, which are nothing other than murderous organizations. Al-Qaeda was founded by the wealthy Osama bin Laden. Note from the internet. Birth name: Osama ibn Muhammad ibn Awad ibn Ladin, a radical Islamic terrorist leader from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, son of a wealthy building contractor, who is responsible for the terrorist attacks of 11 September 2001 with the Al-Qaeda network he founded. Bin Laden called for acts of violence, the Jihad Arabic for holy war, against the Western world, and became a symbolic figure of Islamists, who should not be understood as believers in Islam, because Islamists are basically political murderers and criminals and have nothing to do with the religion of Islam, but only profess it in a lascivious way, but in reality are unscrupulous terrorists and murderers, like the IS members. And it will also happen again in the future, because the dictator Assad has left Syria. And fanaticism will also become great again there, because I know that an Islamist state will emerge there again, after which the devil will be unleashed there another time. Now, I am deviating from what I actually want to say, and what can be said by effectively honest and good believers in Islam. Namely, if something unusual arises, then a dua is said, which is a personal form of supplication or prayer of thanksgiving of the strict believers in Islam and a form of invocation to Allah. A prayer that can be said at any time of the day or night and is different from the ritual prayer salat, which is prescribed and should be said at certain times. Dua is a very important ingredient of Islamic life, as it is believed to be a personal communication with Allah. According to Muslim or Islamic belief, the fate of human beings is already determined in the womb and written on their foreheads, so to speak, whereby their fate cannot be changed and is therefore determined by Allah. Consequently, no human being can escape his destiny or fate, because according to the Islamic faith, it inevitably comes as Allah has determined. What else needs to be mentioned relates to the talisman or amulet eye, which is also used in various other religions around the world and is supposed to ward off the evil eye, which is of course pure nonsense. The eye amulet, which is also worn as jewelry, is known as protection against the evil eye and is absolutely trendy and used by many human beings. As a symbol, it is depicted in photos of delusional believers and is also worn as a talisman because it is believed to protect them from the evil eye nazar and from black magic used by malevolent people. However, this is nothing more than an insanely widespread superstition and completely erroneous, as well as being absolutely un-Islamic, and the use of this eye symbol is a shirk, and therefore something reprehensible, because it means disbelief in Allah, because in Islam it is used to worship God and idolatry, because it means that Allah is attributed an association of gods. Consequently, he is no longer the one and only God, and thus a kind of polytheism comes about. There is a lot more to say about Islam and all that surrounds it, but for now the explanation should suffice and give you a certain impression that can help you to understand some things. So the explanation is actually what was going through my mind about Islam at the moment, but it is only a small fraction of the whole and what I had to say about it. Overall, however, there is still a lot to mention that I have learnt with regard to Alavism, Baha'ism, Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, Sikhism. Alevism. Alevis believe that their god Hak created everything, and that he is part of all things and all living beings, and therefore also part of human beings. Like every religion in their faith, the Alevis therefore have a god that they call God Hak. A principle in Alevism is called, "Do not seek God in foreign places." God is within you if you are pure of heart. To all this, I would like to say that all this would be correct if not a God were involved. But the creation, which is nature, because we have no other name for it, is the universe-wide existence of all that exists. Furthermore, the principle of the Alevis would be correct if a God was not involved, but if the principle was called something like this, "Do not seek your humanity and the truth in foreign places." You alone determine your evolution and the learning of the correct way of life, the dignity and honor towards creation, as well as your behavior and true humanity, if you are willing to recognize and follow this. The belief of Alevis is that human beings have an immortal soul, and that when they become perfect, they can reunite with their God Hak through this soul. Question. The again is questionable, because how and why did he fall away from God Hak? However, human beings can only succeed in doing this if they always work to resolve conflicts and problems and come to an agreement with their fellow human beings in all things. Alevis also believe that God Hak helps and gives them strength in all things and endeavors, etc., and in life as a whole. But ultimately, according to the beliefs and convictions of the Alevis, it is the human being alone who is responsible for every action and deed. Which is also completely correct, I would like to say. Of course, there are also various guidelines in Alevism that believers must, or at least should, follow. But these guidelines are not the same kind of laws, recommendations, or prohibitions, etc., that are common practice in other religions. According to tradition, an Alevi scholar is said to have said, "The human being should control his tongue, his loins and his hands," which may mean that the human being should always keep himself under control. That is to say, not be violent, control the hands, and not slanderous, quarreling, lugubrious and cheating, etc. Control the tongue. Control the tongue, and not be sexually ausartung, control the loins. The human being should not impulsively follow the first thought that comes to his mind, or that inspires him to do something that is not right. Instead of prohibitions and recommendations, the Alevis have a value system that gradually teaches believers the right thing to do, in terms of what is good or bad, correct or incorrect, positive or negative. In order to understand this correctly, the teaching is divided into 4 gates, each of which has 10 steps to be passed through. So-called spiritual guides, who are called rehber, which means guide in Turkic, or simply companions, also support the murit, Turkic, shula. The 4 gates each have a special feature consisting of religious and moral instructions that are particularly aimed at enabling human beings to live together in a good way. This Alevi way, also called yol, is a correct process of learning that the learner or believer knows exactly what is correct or wrong and what is good and what is bad. The history of the Baha'i religion begins with a revelation made by Sayyid Ali Muhammad, known as the Bab Arabic, the Gate. He was the founder of Babism. The second important person was Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri, who was called Baha'u Willah Arabic, Glory of God, and was the actual founder of the Baha'i religion. It all actually began with the appearance of Sheikh Ahmad al-Assa, and also Sayyid Kazim Rushdie and Sheikhism. Sheikhism is a reform movement within Islam whose followers set out in search of the Mahdi, the successor to Muhammad, in anticipation of the Last Judgment. Sheikhism is the name given to Shia Muslims who follow the Shia wisdom teacher Sheikh Ahmad ibn Zainuddin Asayi. Sheikhism, also known as Sheikhism, is the youngest of the 3 schools of so-called Twelfth Shia Islam. This Islam was founded in the early 19th century by Sheikh Ahmad al-Assar, who died in 1826. However, the teaching has remained controversial ever since, although various human beings were also executed as a result of this teaching at the time. But it was then accepted in the middle of the 19th century and gained a certain number of followers who followed the claims of the Bab. As a result, the core of the new movement of Babism was formed, from which the Bahá'í religion also emerged, although this is not important and will not be explained in detail. This is how the Shaykhi faith and all the religious and moral views, the basic principles as well as the details that come from God's book, as well as the traditions of the Prophet and the messages of the Imams came into being. Simply and quickly put, Shaykhism consists of Shi'ism, where the Imams are supposed to be infallible, and 12 followers and descendants of the Prophet, who all try to follow their precepts. As a symbol, the Baha'i often use a star, which is marked with 9 rays. The reason for this is this. The number 9 plays a really big role in the Baha'i religion, because this single-digit number represents the highest perfection and unity for the Baha'i. It is a religious community that actually originated more than 170 years ago and emerged as a branch of Islam. At that time, there were 18 apostles, including a woman who was given an honorable name, Comfort of Eyes, which had a great influence on the early feminists of the time. The Baha'i religion, however, was only correctly founded as an independent religion in Shia Islam in Persia, today's Iran, and it combines elements of other religions and emerged in the 19th century. Islam is considered to be the mother religion of the Baha'i faith, although Islam was copied from Christianity and thus emerged from it, but there are striking differences between all these religions. This is despite the fact that the Baha'i believe in Muhammad as the prophet of God and in the Quran as the word of God of Christianity and Judaism. The Baha'i teachings affirm that Islam, Christianity and Judaism are each a true religion, revealed and truthful by Allah. Accordingly, members of this faith community can unreservedly agree with the traditional words of the Islamic Shahada note, the Islamic Creed. I have explained what Shahada means in Islam. If the roots of the Baha'i religion are considered, then these lie fundamentally in Judaism, Christianity, and also in Islam, and in this case in Shi'ism, because Baha'ism developed from this, and basically all these faiths are related to each other because one has copied the other, so all these religions have developed from each other and all believe in only one God. The ultimate founder of Baha'i was Baha'u'llah, who grew up in Persia, today's Iran, and with the faith of Islam. Initially, he spoke mainly to believers in Islam, but later he wrote letters to believers of different religions, explaining that his divine message was addressed to earth humans, and also that all religions were born from the same source. For this reason, many of the contents of the Baha'i writings also refer to the preceding religions, such as their so-called holy writings, those of the Baha'i religion in particular to the Quran, the Bible, and the Torah. In particular, much of the Baha'i teaching is reminiscent of the religion of Islam, with which the founder of the Baha'i religion grew up. The teachings regarding the teachings of God and the relationship of human beings to their God, and also the God-pleasing life, sound similar to this faith. A great deal is reminiscent not only of Islam, but also of Judaism and Christianity in particular, although the aim of the Baha'i religion is completely new. Unlike all other religions, this religion advocates the unity of humanity and its effective humanity. It explains how human beings should live together peacefully and equally, and how each person is responsible for everything, and also how every human being can feel at home anywhere in the world. And this is something that is also taught by the Nocademian teachings, which are disseminated by the Figu, namely the teaching of truth, the teaching of creation energy, the teaching of life, which, however, does not recognize any god or other deity. but only creation, which holds 7 universes in its vast space, each of which is differently dimensioned and independent of each other. And the Nocademian teachings teach that creation alone is the all-encompassing and impersonalized creation and existence of all that exists. In other terms and words, creation is nature, its entire fauna and flora, as well as the cosmos and the entire universe. And also in this wise the gigantic space and the 7 universes existing in it, which are, however, differently dimensioned and therefore not tangential to each other. However, in addition to the dimension of the present, each individual universe also harbors the countless dimensions of the past and the future. No god or gods, and also no alleged and non-existent spiritual entity of any kind, would ever be able to equal creation in this respect. It is never and in no wise to be worshipped, but it is to be respected with sincere dignity and honor, for it alone is the energy and power of all being, and thus of all existence. This, while the human being alone is responsible for himself and his weal and woe, has to create peace and freedom himself in all honesty and righteousness, without strife, war, envy, strife, murder and manslaughter, lies, deceit, self-importance, irresponsibility, indifference, and always also without Ausartung, greed and lust, violence, hatred, retaliation, revenge, thievery, and other unrighteousness, and much more. The Baha'i religion has the belief and the idea that new revelations are constantly emerging, whereby the Baha'i believers also believe in Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, but their most important revelator is always only Baha'u'llah, who died at the age of around 75. He was therefore the actual founder of Baha'ism and is considered to be the last messenger of God. However, Baha'u'llah also taught that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was extraordinary, because through this sacrifice Jesus purified the world. Baha'u'llah also taught that those who did not accept Jesus Christ deprived themselves of the possibility of seeing the face of God. The Baha'i writings are said to show, as I have been rumored, that Jesus Christ himself left writings, which is a sheer lie, for Emmanuel did not write any letters or other writings that were handed down. Billy, the Kitab-i Aqdas is the Baha'i most holy book, and it was not written by Emmanuel. The most holy book is one of the most important writings for all Baha'i, for in it is written the teaching about God, also the revelation and the religious duties, along with well over 100 other books and many writings which are said to contain messages from God. The goal of the Baha'i is the unity of humanity in its diversity. The Baha'i also have other names for their religion, such as the name Baha, which is written in Arabic and means glory. The Persian founder of the Baha'i religion, Glory of God, was Baha'u'llah from Tehran, who claimed to be a messenger of God and to teach that his revelation was that there was an impulse for the ennoblement of human character, as well as also for social progress. He thus brought the glory of God, or Baha'ism, to human beings, which is said to have been given around 150 years ago in the 19th century. The human beings had supposedly already been expecting his arrival and his message, as Bab had announced both to them. To repeat, the Baha'i religion begins with a revelation from Sayyid Ali Muhammad, the Bab Arabic, the Gate, the actual founder of Babism. The other and second important person was Mirza Hussain Ali Nuri, equals Baha'u'llah. Arabic, Glory of God, was the founder of the Baha'i religion. However, everything begins with the work of Sheikh Ahmad al-Ahsa and Sayyid Kazim Rashti in Sheikhism. There are actually no prohibitions in Baha'ism, but rather counsels such as, for example, that every dispute, fight and war, as well as differences of opinion about matters of faith, drinking alcohol and the consumption of other drugs should be refrained from. This also applies to smoking. Cigarettes and other tobacco products are included, although drinking coffee and tea are not. There are around 8 million Baha'i worldwide. Here in Switzerland, there could be around 1,300 to 1,500, with around a quarter living in India. In Persia or Iran, there are probably a few 100,000, with small groups existing in all countries around the world. When praying, all Baha'i turn towards the shrine in Acre in Haifa in Israel, whereby this shrine of the Bab is also the tomb of the actual founder of the religion of Babism. The tomb and the shrine are a Baha'i shrine. And when the Baha'i pray, they can say their prayers aloud or just in their thoughts, but they can also sing, kneeling, sitting, or standing. What is important, however, is a respectful inner and outer attitude, which is full of respect for their God of creators, who has no actual name, so he is only called all-glorious, as well as all-merciful, all-loving, all-knowing, all-conscious, all-powerful, and all-wise, incomparable, and helper. This is how the Baha'i express God. There are no dietary laws in Baha'ism, apart from the fact that alcohol and other drugs should be excluded from consumption. Pork can be eaten by the Baha'i, not like in Islam as it is downright forbidden. However, the Baha'i scriptures suggest that a diet of plant products is healthy and preferable, that is to say vegetables, grains, nuts and fruit, etc., so there is no special food regulation. However, alcohol and other drugs are taboo. The aim of the Baha'i religion is that one day all human beings on earth should live a vegetarian life. As already mentioned, alcohol and other drugs are taboo for Baha'i, as they are unhealthy and dull the mind, as well as health and reason in general. Chocolates, ice cream, and other foods that contain alcohol are also generally avoided. A Baha'i marriage means that two partners enter into a firm mutual bond with each other in honest affection with head and heart, whereby the two also endeavor to explore and familiarize themselves with each other's nature to the best of their ability. This alone can guarantee that the firm bond between the two will last a lifetime. Baha'u'llah was born in Tehran, Persia, in 1817 to a noble family. His name was Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri. As a child, he is said to have had a good character and been very clever. In later years, he was offered a high position at the imperial court, but he turned it down and instead worked for the poor and the sick. As a result, he quickly became known as the father of the poor. Even as a young man, Baha'u'llah had heard of Bab's teaching and supported Bab and his aims. He was imprisoned for this, like many others of Bab's believers. It was only because many important human beings and believers stood up for him that Baha'u'llah was released from prison in Tehran. But he and his family were exiled from Persia to Baghdad in the neighboring country. From there he was expelled to Istanbul in 1863, where he proclaimed his calling to human beings. In prison, he explained that a voice had announced to him that he was the promised one, who had already been announced by prophets of earlier religions. He therefore brought a new teaching that was to be proclaimed for the peaceful coexistence of all human beings throughout the world. In accordance with this declaration, he henceforth called himself Baha'u'llah, and his religion Glory of God. He made his Bahaism known far and wide, wherever he could, also proclaiming his mission in many letters to the rulers of his time and calling on them never to wage war again and henceforth to rule the people justly. He told everyone that the new teaching was from God and was a truthful and effective revelation, as well as a true divine task. Baha'u'llah was also named after him. Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, born in Lumbini today, Nepal, about 2,590 years ago, is falsely named as the founder of the Buddhist faith. He was an Indian wisdom teacher, and his title of honor was Buddha, the Awakened One. Siddhartha Gautama brought the teaching of self-recognition and self-education, which he created largely through self-experience as well as through valuable teachings from Svarth, the Plejaren, but which corresponded largely in their origin to self-awareness. However, Buddha was really only a title or a designation for what he had developed ascetically through his strict world of thought. He was supposedly the founder of the religion of Buddhism. But this is not true, because his original teaching was completely different from what he had learned through ascetic self-awareness and had supplemented and optimized with the help of asket. So the teaching was truly not a religion in its origin, but a teaching of life, a teaching of the guidance of self-learning of one's own mental abilities. And this was and is the ascetic learning as well as experience and knowledge, which is fully devoted to the rational, to reason, and therefore also to intellectuals, and absolutely far removed from any religious person of any religion. Even at the time of Siddhartha Gautama, a secret Shivan sect had the audacity to call themselves called unknowledgeable, and to describe Siddhartha's teachings as vicious illusions and fantasies. This then underground sect, which existed secretly for about 600 years, around 2,800 years ago, advocated the idea of realizing the power-energy development of thought and will, which they henceforth called the teaching of the ladder to enlightenment and then nirvana. Ultimately, this became Buddha doctrine and Buddhism, which, however, no longer had much to do with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, but with illusion and fantasy, and has survived in this form to this day. After Siddhartha Gautama's death, this sect continued to endeavor to further undermine Siddhartha's teaching in accordance with their ideas and took everything so far that the falsified teaching developed into an erroneous belief, after which the sect disbanded around 2,200 years ago and Buddhism in its current form emerged from it, which split into various sects that are represented worldwide today. The symbol Dharmachakra Sanskrit, the Dharmachakra wheel of the law, from chakra equals wheel and dharma equals law, which Siddhartha Gautama Buddha created together with Svarth and used from then on when he proclaimed and taught his teachings very widely, that is to say, that which was really his teaching, but which was not only from Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, but also partly from Svarth, caused a great stir, but also misunderstanding and hostility, especially among the secret Shivan sect. The Dharmachakra symbol, which was created in collaboration with Svarth, who befriended Siddhartha Gautama while traveling back in time, represents a wheel with 8 spokes, which is intended to remind us of the important 8 virtues that human beings should live by, which are those that have been given since time immemorial by Nocademian's teachings on life, namely the high positive balanced values of the
teaching of the truth, teaching of the creation energy, teaching of the life, as Svarth gave these to Siddhartha Gautama, and he taught them very widely. And these are now mentioned here, namely as they were given by Svarth and also taught by Siddhartha Gautama, but which were fundamentally distorted after his death, but are to be reproduced here in the correct wise, as they were given very precisely by Svarth, according to the ancient teaching of Nocademion, and as Siddhartha had also received them from Svarth, who then also passed them on as teaching. This teaching began fundamentally with the symbol of the Dharmachakra, or with the explanations of the 8 spokes of the wheel, quite understandably as follows. Note: creation energy teaching symbol luck 1, correct realization samadhi, understanding the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama is especially dedicated to the 4 noble truths, which are the profound teaching of the conditioned arising of A. the suffering and pain of life, B. recognizing the real causes, C. in overcoming and ending them, D. in freedom in the cessation of all suffering and pain, in the cessation of life. 2. Correct attitude Samasankappa, the working out and arising of a good, valuable as well as balanced and beneficial world of thoughts and feelings, as well as the world of emotions. That is to say, comprehensively in the positive all-best balance. Recognizing and acknowledging the truth, clear-sightedness, honesty, compassion, generosity, goodness, empathy, helpfulness, reliability, honor and dignity, respect, purposefulness, love, peacefulness, affection, assertiveness, resilience in relation to self-perception, optimism, self-regulation, acceptance, solution orientation, future orientation, action orientation, avoidance of negative thoughts, negative feelings, negative emotions, negative unworthiness, desires, vices, revenge, retaliation, lustfulness, depression, sickness, hatred, envy, addiction, enmity, misanthropy, doubt, anger, humiliation, narcissism, falsehood, anger, need for recognition, intolerance, anger. 3. Correct speech. Samavaka, never lie. Never speak untruthfully. Avoid offensive speech. Avoid harsh speech. Always use only honest speech. Always choose truthful speech. Gentle speech creates calm and trust. Constructive speech. Calm speech creates trust and solves problems. Peaceful speech creates friendship. Never speak in a grandiloquent manner, for it brings trouble. Distrust and enmity. Speaking arrogantly creates dislike. Speaking viciously creates resentment and harsh dislike. As all calm speech avoids all quarrels, etc. 4. Right action samakamanta. Right action never hurts, and right action avoids stealing and cheating. Right action refrains from all sexual abuses. Right action avoids all degeneracy and wrongdoing. By right action, no righteous human being commits any unrighteous acts, etc. 5. Right living sama ajiva, a human being who leads a righteous life, which is never directed towards killing in wars, in revenge, retribution and punishment, as also not towards theft, cheating, murder, abuse, or anything based on illicit trade, but his mind and endeavor is steadily directed towards honesty, justice, and responsibility. 6. Righteous endeavor samavayama. The righteous human being lives constantly in an effort to avoid negative thoughts and feelings and to cultivate a positive, balanced mind and to develop and cultivate all that is positive in daily life and existence. 7. Right mindfulness samasati. The ability, through right mindfulness, to observe one's own world of thoughts through one's very own creative life energy, as well as to consciously judge and direct everything correctly through it, but never unconsciously or consciously condemning anything, but reasonably consciously advising to correct, as well as thereby also consciously evolving, brings the meaning of life to blood and effect, as well as to fulfillment. 8. Right concentration, sama samadhi. The development of mental clarity through to mental and meditative concentration brings mindfulness of reality and its incontrovertible truth. These are the 8 virtues which are linked together and form a whole. They support each other and call for an ethical and valuable way of life that is actively enlivened by creative energy in every situation and time, strengthens all the virtues and by practicing them, avoids all negative consequences and allows everything positive to be sown and brought to flourishing effect. The 8 virtues, as they were also given to Siddhartha Gautama, according to the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, he also described them fully as they were given to him. And these are not specifically meant for Buddhists only, but for all human beings on earth who are willing to concentrate on learning them and want to walk the path of self-liberation. So the whole thing also says that 8 groups of auspicious symbols appear that were originally used in India, such as in Buddhist ceremonies, as well as in official ceremonies or in the crowning of a king, etc. The very early symbols that were grouped together were the handprint, the swastika and the hooked knot, as well as the throne and the pair of fish, the jeweled vase and water bottle and the lidded scarf. Buddhism also has nirvana, which for Buddhists means the highest happiness, and in this context, it is always good to have an enlightened person as a friend or to meet such a person, because life is illuminated by such a person and the whole world is also illuminated by his light or his great knowledge and wisdom, so that through his wisdom the path through life and to happiness is shown. Siddhartha Gautama grew up in Kapilavastu and was a prince of the Shakya clan. Shortly before his birth, his mother Maya dreamt that a white elephant with 6 white tusks was carrying her son far away. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was originally an Indian prince who practiced meditation and strict asceticism. Asceticism is a way of life that involves a voluntary renunciation of sensual pleasures and worldly comforts, often centered on spiritual or philosophical goals, and is also associated with voluntary sexual abstinence and a very high level of discipline of the passions in order to achieve a high-quality goal. So there are also other very important details associated with this that need to be learnt if enlightenment is to be achieved. Enlightenment is nothing other than the fact that true humanity is to be learnt and then cultivated in everything. The human being must do this by making an honest and true effort to recognize his entire world of thoughts and feelings, his emotional world and sensations, his actions and behavior, as well as his full and complete attitude to life and his attitude to the daily happenings of the environment and his fellow human beings, to nature and its fauna and flora, and thus to creation and its existence in every way with dignity and honor, treating them accordingly and living them in an irreproachable manner. This also means that the whole of life as well as the mind, reason and the whole of life's behavior is directed towards this in every correct and just wise, whereby all suffering, all greed, all hatred, all lust, all revenge and retaliation, all desire to be great and to be more, as well as every other form of Ausartung, is to be overcome, and the whole of life's behavior is blameless. Originally, the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama was something completely different from what today's completely falsified. Buddhism teaches and has nothing to do with the effective teaching of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha and has become deviant. It should be said and explained that although Siddhartha came from a North Indian noble family in India about 2,590 years ago and spread his teachings far and wide in the north of what was then India for about 50 years before he died at the age of about 80, he was free of aristocratic airs and graces. Very modest and truly led an irreproachable ascetic life. This was despite the fact that he had very unpleasant experiences outside of his parents' palace during his lifetime, and was hostile and even threatened with death. And in truth, he first summarized his teachings entirely on his own before Svarth made his acquaintance and taught him according to Nocodemian's teachings. He also taught and founded this teaching, but over time it became hostile and was eventually labeled Buddhism, which was later falsely described as a world religion. What Siddhartha Gautama really taught was a teaching of becoming human, which was also the teaching of leading away the self-learning of one's own mental faculties, which refers to the knowledge and learning of that which teaches human beings to learn the intellectual aspects of their mind and their responsibility, as well as their behavior and responsibility in life. And this is far removed from any religion. But the whole thing is aimed solely at helping human beings to develop into true human beings on their own responsibility and initiative. How they should lead their world of thoughts, feelings and emotions as well as their actions and behavior in a positive and balanced way and live correctly. And this within the framework of the teaching of Nocedemion through the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, which is taught extensively by the Figu and which Siddhartha Gautama taught and spread in small part in his teaching around 2,600 years ago, but which became hostile and fundamentally distorted over time and became the Buddhism known throughout the world today. This is practically the same way that the teaching of Emmanuel became Christianity through endless falsifications, and the teaching of Muhammad became Islam. So the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama has nothing to do with what today's Buddhism, which is widespread throughout the world, practices, misleads, and abuses religiously. Siddhartha Gautama also left his home because he was in search of further knowledge. So he also gave up his palace life after he had recognized 4 things that he summarized as a necessity of life and that should be done by every human being, which he summarized in the symbol of the Dharma chakra. This is still of importance to say, in the teaching and life of Siddhartha Gautama, there was no hint or prediction of a Buddha Maitreya to appear as the last earthly Buddha. Siddhartha's teaching also made no mention of 5 earthly Buddhas, each of whom was supposed to be assigned to one of the 5 ages Kala, because Siddhartha's teaching did not deal with such nonsense. Siddhartha Gautama was a spindly man, a human being who did not have a big belly, which is supposed to represent prosperity, just as the laughter of the big-bellied Buddha statue also only represents an invented and fraudulent happiness and does not represent a human being who had any relation to the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama. The historical Siddhartha Gautama is also not the founder of Buddhism. He was and is also not a god, but was a very humble ascet human being.
What else I have to say, Billy.
The teachings of Siddhartha Gautama taught that there is no God, which is also maintained in Buddhism today, despite the tremendous falsification of Siddhartha's teachings. Nevertheless, Buddhism is considered a religion without God, because no almighty creator is worshipped. Because Siddhartha Gautama's teaching was originally focused on creation as such, namely on nature and all universal existence in the form of the purest energy and power. However, this is completely disregarded in today's guided Buddhism. An explanation of the teachings and differences to other religions, which erroneously worship a God-creator, has thus been preserved beyond recognition despite the falsification of the teachings. Buddhism, when viewed correctly, embodies one of the great world religions and fascinates millions of human beings worldwide who, however, do not realize that Buddhism is not a religion and is a complete misconception and falsification of what Siddhartha Gautama's teaching effectively and truly was. This has now been made clear, but it is more than questionable whether this will change anything about this misconception and lead to the correct teaching. Sikhs. I do not know much about this, but that the khanda or khala is an Indian sword that has a wide, single-edged blade with a disc-shaped pommel that tapers to a point. It is used as a religious symbol of Sikhism, with the khanda representing secular and spiritual authority in this context. A religious symbol of the Sikhs, however, is the Ik Onkar, also known as Ek Onkar, which is basically intended to represent the central principle of the oneness of God, and is another symbol of Sikhism. It is the most important religious symbol of Sikhism. The Sikhi way of life and human beings who follow it are naturally called Sikh, which means schoolman. This is a human being who is willing to learn and who is supposedly guided exclusively by mental wisdom, which also means that he is wise and, as a Sikhi, understands a lot about life. In addition, a Sikhi, female or male, is supposed to recognize their own creative, energetic origin, which enables them to lead a good life. The Sikh way of life is also called the Sikh religion. Sikhism is a monotheistic religion which, as far as I know, was founded in northern India in the 15th century by a Guru Nanak. The followers, who, as mentioned, are called Sikhs, by and large believe in a single, omnipotent and eternal God. They regard him as the source of all things. The teachings of Sikhism focus on the unity of this God, and also on the service that should be rendered to all human beings, regardless of gender, origin, or religion, and of course to the entire mass of humanity in perfect equality. Guru Granth Sahib is the scripture of the Sikhs, and the religion fundamentally propagates service to humanity. My thoughts on this: this is actually the case with all world religions, but the rule proves that the whole thing is just empty phrases. Because as soon as something creeps over the liver of any believer that does not please, offends or even harms, disadvantages or harms him or her, that creates hatred, revenge, retaliation or disadvantage, then the service to human beings evaporates in a flash and evokes a variety of negative things, leading to long-lasting quarrels or even murder and manslaughter, or even lifelong enmity or war between groups or countries. And this is something that has been held for a long and ancient time and does not change for the better, for the good and for the positive, but is only given by religions in a scrounging way, and is not, and never aimed at teaching human beings in detail in this regard, and making them realize that they alone are responsible for everything they think, do and act. This, while instead believers are nonsensically demanded to have a meaningless faith and meaningless prayers to an imaginary God, completely infinitely far removed from what true human being and service to human beings would require. No money is earned and hoarded in this way, but only with insane religious lies and evil deception in the form of faith, which human beings incapable of thinking for themselves faithfully fall for and do not realize that they are being fleeced like Christmas geese by religious lies and deception. Sikhism was founded as a religious movement in the 16th century by Guru Nanak. He tried to combine the positive characteristics of Islam and Hinduism in a new religion. The Sikh shrine is the central golden temple of Amritsar in the Indian state of Punjab. The truth is, as with any other religion, Sikhs are called upon to help other human beings and do good, although the Sikh religion is distinct and has its own recognizable features, traditions, and so-called holy scriptures. They also have many practices and rituals that reflect their religious practice in many ways. And, like all religions and sects, they celebrate various religious festivals and also consider certain places and objects to be extremely sacred. And it is to be said that the Sikh religion has a long and rich history, which is of course also brought into the field, and to which the Sikh faithful adhere. The Sikh religion has been influenced by a variety of factors, including encounters with other religions and also political developments in India. Over time, Sikhism has evolved and is now spread all over the world. Food is favored by the Sikhs if it has been freshly prepared in the family circle or in the community. There are also vegetarians among the Sikhs, who therefore avoid all meat, and some Sikhs also avoid eggs. Alcohol and other intoxicants of all kinds are forbidden in Sikhism, especially those who are Amritdhari and have been initiated into the Khalsa, as explained to me by a customs. officer who let me see the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and also explained that a Sikh woman is not allowed to marry a Catholic man. Waheguru is the God in whom the Sikhs believe, and who is without form and neither woman nor man, because according to the Sikhi teachings, all human beings are equal, regardless of their gender, origin, or religion. As a monotheistic religion, Sikhism therefore believes in only one God and Creator, Ik Onkar, who is not represented figuratively or in any other way. The Sikhs reject the caste system, but they advocate equal rights for women, both in general and on a religious basis. They also believe in the rebirth of the soul and in karma, or the law of cause and effect. Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world and has the Om sign as its symbol in the Devanagari script, although other symbol versions exist, such as the sacred sound symbol. The following can be found on the Internet. Note: Internet excerpt. The symbol is said to represent the universe and the highest reality, Brahman. It is placed in front of all Vedic mantras and prayers, but is sometimes also appended. The Om, pronounced Aum, is often referred to as a symbol for God in the three aspects Brahman A, Vishnu U, and Shiva M. However, Om is undisputedly the most important Hindu symbol, which is also very often used as an emblem of Hinduism. It also consecrates the swastika, which is considered to bring good luck and is an ancient sun sign. There are also praying hands, which is a sign of respect for the sacred, while in everyday life it means the greeting Namaste. Lotus Padma is the symbol of purity transcendence. Om, also known as Aum, is a syllable that is considered sacred by Hindus and also by Buddhists, whereby the sound of Om is regarded as the primordial sound from which, according to Hindu belief, the vibrations of the creation of the entire universe emerged. The symbol Om is used in Hinduism for several things, such as the three main gods, Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, and Shiva the destroyer, as well as the three gunas, or energies of nature: Sattva harmony, Rajas action, and Tamas tragedy. The three sacred Vedas, Rigveda, Yajurveda, and Samaveda. Hinduism is also called Sanatana Dharma, which stands for eternal law, and has around 1.3 billion followers. It is an ancient Indian world religion with a variety of faith currents based on ancient Indian sacred texts and the Vedas. The worship of various gods and goddesses and the teaching of rebirth and the law of karma are characteristic, as is also the strong connection to the caste system. Hinduism has 330 million gods and goddesses, as well as the belief that all souls of all living beings are reborn after their death. For this reason, Hinduism also speaks of transmigration of souls, whereby human beings, animals, etc., and plants come back to Earth, even as gods, depending on how the life form behaves in the present life. Hindu religions have no religious founders like other religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but there are countless gods and goddesses as well as seers and saints. Over the past 4,000 years of its existence, Hinduism has given rise to a very dense network of religious and philosophical currents, whereby the very many and extremely diverse worlds of imagination have been recorded in many scriptures. Hinduism is not an organized religion in and of itself, so it does not only have a systematic approach to the diversity of teaching and its value systems. Hindus also have virtues that they are supposed to follow, namely bravery, wisdom, justice and moderation, etc., as far as women are concerned in Hinduism, they are subordinate to their husbands, both religiously and socially, because they are considered sensual and unstable. For this reason, they are to be protected and kept under control by the men, just as marriages are also arranged. It is only when a son is born after the marriage that a woman's social standing is valued somewhat more highly. Nevertheless, the woman is less valued than the man and is not authorized to perform any religious rituals independently. Of course, there are also important rules in Hinduism, such as the teaching of Siddhartha Gautama, namely 5 rules that must be strictly observed, such as 1. Hindu believers are not allowed to drink alcohol, which is the opposite in Christianity, and therefore, countless women and men are alcohol addicts or alcoholics and therefore alcoholics, because Hinduism prohibits the consumption of any kind of alcohol. 2. Hindu believers are not allowed to drink. 3. Hindu believers are not allowed to kill anyone and therefore may not commit murder. 4. Hindu believers were not allowed to eat meat. 5. Hindu believers are not allowed to commit adultery. These also include points understood as life goals, such as duty, ethics, prosperity, fulfillment and joy, etc. As for Brahman, this is the world soul, and a central concept of Hindu philosophy, especially in the Vedanta and the Upanishads, whereby Brahman is the name for the immutable, immortal absolute, and thus the highest. In Hinduism, pork, insects, snails, rabbits, seafood, fish without scales, and dog meat are also not allowed to be eaten. Various Hindu religions also have bans on meat consumption, with some Hindus completely rejecting meat consumption. Ritual purification, as well as certain breathing exercises, and the recitation of sacred verses, as well as the worship of gods, and the expulsion of spirits and demons, are part of Hinduism, which strives for liberation. According to Hindu belief, the approximately 330 million gods and goddesses live in large and small temples, but also in stones, trees, rivers, shrines and animals, whereby the trio of gods Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, the best-known gods of Hinduism, are worshipped by the faithful at home and in temples, in a wide variety of incarnations and with many different names and designations. In most cases, several characteristics are ascribed to the gods, but when they are grouped together, they are seen as a single characteristic. For example, when Brahma is seen as the creator of the universe in the trinity of gods, with Vishnu as the preserver, Shiva as the destroyer, and Brahma as the world soul. However, if, for example, God Shiva is alone, then he combines creative, preserving and destructive aspects at the same time. This is actually what my thoughts about Hinduism revolve around, but I would also like to mention that the relationships of the gods and goddesses and their character traits are in a constant state of flux, as are the names of the gods and goddesses, so everything is constantly changing, but everything always remains the same in terms of their essence. A bit crazy, but that is the way it is. And then it occurs to me that alongside all the gods and goddesses who somehow appear to be conceived as figures, they nevertheless function as formless concepts of God in the many different Indian religions. It should also be said that Hindus refer to their various beliefs as Sanatana Dharma, which is understood as eternal law, although the term Hindu is actually an old Persian term for human beings who lived on the eastern side of the Indus River. It should also be explained that a guru is a teacher, a term that comes from the ancient Indian language Sanskrit. The guru actually imparts knowledge to his disciples, who are supposed to find their way out of the darkness of their ignorance into the light. So the guru teaches and advises his followers and disciples in the areas of knowledge, but also in relation to the soul, emotional and physical experience, whereby many Indian families follow a guru, as I have experienced. A pandit is a scholar who often speaks Sanskrit and knows the sacred scriptures and their associated rituals. Then there is the pujari, who performs the daily rituals in the temple, with regular religious services taking place in the temples, often from morning to evening. These services are called puja, during which the priest worships the gods with the help of incense, flowers, prayers, and sweets. These rituals are often accompanied by bells, drums, and singing. And that is actually what I have in my mind right now, although I can say more about it when we talk about it again later. But now I want to talk about Jesuitism, which is a religion that has no binding holy scripture, and which originated before Christianity. Your grandfather Sfaarth and I were able to fathom that this religion was created 2,344 years ago, before Christianity. I was particularly interested in Uruk, which, as we were able to find out, was first created 4,970 years before the birth of Emmanuel, which completely contradicts what the clever historians claim as a result of their assumptions. Consequently, what is claimed today is not true, like much else that such scientists also claim. So it turns out that the beginning of this religion was about 7,000 years ago. Uruk was also by far the largest settlement in southern Mesopotamia 5,500 years ago, and could even be described as a real city. At that time, it was widely known for its monumental buildings, with striking works of art and paintings. However, around 1840 years ago, as had already happened in earlier times, a new natural climate change began, which meant that all land began to dry out on a very large scale, and Uruk and the surrounding area had to be abandoned. Well, Uruk is actually the site of the earliest writing, and Uruk was already one of the leading political centers of the Sumerian territories around 6 millennia ago. Today's ancient city of Uruk is located in Iraq, and it was effectively one of the most important cities that existed at the time as the center of Sumerian civilization. It is known today for probably the earliest form of actual writing, as well as the emergence of probably the first urban society. Uruk was really very imposing, and indeed a major city and also religiously important, with an internet note, heaven, meaning heaven. Unfortunately, I know very little about Yazidism because I did not live in the Kurdish area for very long, so I can use the internet when it is advisable, which I will mark as such. But what I do know is this: the members of the Yazidi faith today are mostly Kurds who are monotheistic in their faith, and therefore believe in and also worship only one omnipotent God. The Yazidi faith also includes the transmigration of souls and life after death. The faith, as well as customs and songs, as someone recently assured me, was handed down until the 3rd millennium, exclusively orally, with customs and songs still playing an important role today. A peacock, I remember, was or is the symbol of the Yazidis, and it is said to represent an angel called Melek Taus, who is worshipped. Melek Taus is said to be the first angel of creation, according to Yazidi belief, and his splendidly colored feathers symbolize the beauty and diversity of the world. I do not know how many believers there are in the Yazidi religious community, but the person who gave me some information recently estimated that there are probably around 1 million human beings worldwide who profess the Yazidi faith, which I think is probably far too many. Yazidism is an ancient monotheistic religion, as I have already explained, but it has elements from West Persian and ancient Mesopotamian religions, as well as from Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Thus, the origin of Yazidism, which is derived from the main religions practiced today and the ancient religions, goes back up to 4,000 or 7,000 years, although the Yazidis have no holy scriptures, as I have already said. And I repeat that the Yazidi faith has been handed down exclusively orally well into the 3rd millennium and up to the present day. What I still know is that, according to Yazidi mythology, God is said to have created a 7-colored rainbow from his light and in the form of the angel Melek Taus, who is said to be one of a total of 7 archangels of the Yazidis, whereby the blue peacock symbolizes the angel and his beauty, as well as his dominion over the 6 other angels. The sacred texts of the Yazidi believers are, as I remember, called calls. I remember that because it sounds like a spring. From this, I remember, the believers get and take their religious understanding, with which they orientate themselves for their lives. The supreme representative of the one and only God is a supreme angel, who is called Tau Lasi Malek, and is also symbolized by a peacock, and is therefore also a symbol of Yazidism. The peacock is also understood by the Yazidis as a symbol note internet, icon of Tawusi Melek, which is supposed to represent the diversity of the world, whereby the colorfulness of the peacock's plumage is also considered a symbol of the countless colors of nature. The Yazidi faith therefore recognizes only one omnipotent God, who created all fauna and flora, and also the world. He alone has given human beings all their senses, and also their intellect and reason, so that they can decide for themselves on all their actions, and above all on the correct path in life, so that every human being is responsible for their own actions and deeds. I remember a cloth note, internet, bazinbar, a red and white ribbon woven together with cotton thread, which is worn to protect against harm and misfortune, whereby a religious tradition is also observed that certain shades of blue clothing should not be worn, which is said to be related to the Yazidi society's love of nature, because the color blue symbolizes the sky, so avoiding it expresses respect for God. Judaism, and if I now want to say something about its God Yahweh, then he represents an immaterial, omnipotent and omnipresent God of sacrifice, who is supposed to rule both justly and mercifully, whereby the Jews see themselves as his chosen people, because a covenant was supposedly made with him. And when I come to the symbol of Judaism, I have learnt in all my studies of this religion that it has several symbols that are respected. The most important symbols of Judaism are first and foremost the Star of David, the Kippah, and the Menorah, the Tefillin, the Mesus, Talit, Zizit, and Chamsa. The Star of David, which is also called the Magen David Shield of David, is actually a hexagram which, among other things, also embodies the 6-pointed star, a 6-pointed star formed from 2 interwoven equilateral triangles. If you connect the points of the hexagram with 6 lines, a hexagon is formed. The Star of David is also called the Shield of David, which is considered the actual symbol of Judaism and at the same time of the people of Israel. Next is the 7-branched candlestick, or menorah, which is a reminder of the creation of the world and also symbolizes the Sabbath. The best-known symbol of Judaism is also the emblem of the state flag of Israel, but the symbolism of the Star of David is multifaceted and was originally primarily, and among other things, decisive for the unification of the people, which was considered meritorious of King David. However, the Star of David was badly and very negatively misused by the insane National Socialists during the Third Reich, whereby Jews, women, children, and men were murdered and annihilated by the Nazis and National Socialists many millions of times over. The kippah embodies the reverence for God, and the menorah is a seven-armed candlestick that symbolizes the seventh day. Even then, as a boy in the 1940s, I coined the term Nazi-minded for human beings with a war mentality during the World War, as a result of which, for me, they are all Nazis or human beings whose attitudes and opinions, etc., are orientated towards war instead of peace, freedom, and love, regardless of whether they are female or male, which religious faith, state, and which religion or other denomination they belong to. Thus, all human beings are Nazis, at least in their erroneous and confused illusory thoughts, and in this respect, they are nothing other than murderers, because their evil attitude towards war and support for war, such as the supply of weapons and money, etc., for it and the continuation of war, is contrary to any will for peace, freedom, love, shelter, security, safety, and order for life and existence. Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and other diverse religions, and many of their sects, believe in the same God, but nevertheless they associate quite different ideas with this God. Christians only speak of their God in the wise way in which the corruptors, liars, and deceivers have created the Bible and thus also the New Testament. Jews, on the other hand, do not speak of God without mentioning God's will and recommendations. Note, Internet, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Sephardic, or Hora Israel. The Eternal, our God, the Eternal is one. Note, Internet, the mezuzah, a small capsule with a scroll containing God's recommendations, is attached to the door to protect the household. The kippah is a small head covering intended to express reverence for God. The tefillin are prayer straps that are tied to the arm and forehead for prayer, while the chamsa is a symbol of the protecting hand. The menorah, or seven-armed candlestick, is the oldest of all symbols of Judaism and is even depicted on the Israeli coat of arms. One arm of the candlestick stands for each day of the creation story, 6 days in total, while the seventh arm stands for the day of rest, that is to say Shabbat, which is the central arm in the middle and from which 3 arms branch off on each side. Note, Internet, elaborated list of symbols, the Star of David Hebrew Magen, David's Shield of David, is one of the symbols of Judaism. The Jewish religion is the oldest of the monotheistic religions. In Judaism, the temple, and thus the Wailing Wall, was a place where God comes to the faithful and is considered the holiest place of the Jews. The ritual of small pieces of paper with prayers or various blessings also originated from this assumption. The Star of David Hebrew, Magen David Shield of David, is one of the symbols of Judaism. It is a hexagram consisting of 2 interwoven triangles. It is one of the best known and most widely used symbols of Judaism and the people of Israel, according to Wikipedia. Menorah, a 7-armed candlestick that commemorates the creation of the world in 7 days. The 7th arm stands for the Sabbath, as explained on MDR. Mezuzah, a small capsule containing a scroll with the recommendations of God. It is attached to the door to protect the household, as explained on Hannes Holland. Kippah, a head covering worn as a sign of reverence for God. Tefillin prayer straps, tied to the arm and forehead for prayer to harmonize the mind action, and feeling, as described on Wikipedia. Chamsa, the symbol of the protecting hand, which is also known in Islam and Christianity. Talit, a prayer shawl that is put on during prayer. Zizit, the bundles on the edges of the talit that serve as a reminder of God's recommendations. Chai, the Hebraic word for life, often used as a symbol of Judaism. This is why you will find a small long box, the mezuzah, on the right-hand doorpost of Jewish houses or flats. Inside is a parchment scroll on which the prayer Shema Israel is written. When you leave or return home, you touch the mezuzah and ask God for protection. And is it even permissible to give up land that God promised to the people of Israel? God promised our forefather Abraham, "I have given this land to your seed." Our right to Eretz Israel is a historical right, but above all it is a gift, just like the Torah. Shalom Hebrew, central term in Judaism and greeting formula peace, salvation. Shalom name, a family name and first name. 4 name bearers, see there.
That is everything that is currently buzzing around in my brain, and what I can pull out of the internet. We can continue to talk about it bit by bit. So I can tell you a bit more about what I know, but some things can also be found and supplemented on the internet because there is certainly more there than I know myself.
Yes, you are right. But what does not correspond to any imagination are the articles you wrote in your youth, such as this one, which I photographed from my grandfather's annals, and which I want to name here and partly read to you, but which I will dictate to you in the next few days. So listen to the article that my grandfather Svath left behind in his estate.
Earth humans do not care for nature and its fauna and flora, and therefore does not care about creation and all its existence. Sunday, 7th May 1950, checked for correctness. Svath Eddie Meyer, Niederflax 1253, Bülach.
In the future, many malicious and exploitative things will happen on Earth to the Earth's resources and forests, as well as negative and destructive things to the planet through the building up of land, floodplains and meadows, mountain areas, etc., as well as irreparable damage and disaster, and also the extermination of fauna and flora, many thousands of genera and species. This will take place through countless machinations of the overflowing great mass of Earth humans. And everything will far exceed the destruction of nature, fauna, and flora, as well as the waters, land, atmosphere, and all areas, etc., of the war that ended 5 years ago. This is because, with regard to the great overmass of humanity, through their machinations and indifference, everything on Earth will come to such an extent that one day technology, in the form of artificial intelligence, will even rule over Earth humans. And the beginning of the development for this will be in the next 3 decades. And only 40 years later, in the early years of the 3rd millennium, everything will be so developed in this respect that it will be impossible to counteract the state of the end of evil and the evil of what is to come. And in the future, this will be the result of the low intelligence and indifference of the majority of humanity, which will allow that part of the unfit rulers to rule and reign completely irresponsibly, who in their greed for power and irresponsibility, and in their inability to govern either in righteousness or with understanding and reason, will not know how to do the correct thing. On the contrary, he will do so by harassing human beings and playing nasty with them, fighting them and curtailing their rights and freedom through illogical laws, rules and regulations, etc. And still in this 20th century, 35 years from now, In the mid-1980s, the first technical electronic developments for an artificial intelligence will secretly begin to determine the daily lives of human beings in such a way that their genius will become more and more stunted and surpassed by a lack of general knowledge. This artificial intelligence will have very catastrophic effects because it will be so detrimental to the majority of Earth humans that it will take away their own thinking and make them hopelessly dependent. This will be tantamount to a technical electronic enslavement of faith, which, as with religious delusion, will inevitably lead to a pseudo-thinking that encompasses the whole world. The technical developments of the future will bring masses of new products and herald the beginning of a situation in which Earth humans will soon and very quickly become hopelessly dependent on the new technology. Even children, who will then, unfortunately, be encouraged by adults to adopt innovations of all kinds. This will be particularly the case with new things, especially the new means of communication that will inevitably come in the future, when these will function as small portable mobile phones in about 50 years' time. As a result, writing letters and messages and much general correspondence will also be replaced by electronic forms in the future. All means of transport will also become addictive and delusional in the future, along with the mind and reason and other pathogenic natural, medical, and chemical drugs of all kinds, which will become so addictive that it will no longer be possible to do without them. This will also apply in particular to cars, which will be regarded as prestige objects in the future, but will emit a lot of toxic gases and cause lasting damage to the climate. As a result, however, the atmosphere will become heavily polluted and toxic to breathe, which will lead to countless human beings falling ill, often with various types of cancer and respiratory problems, etc., and the climate will also be polluted to the point of collapse. This will also be the case as a result of a sea of ever larger and ever more spacious passenger aircraft for masses of holiday travelers, as well as countless ever larger transport aircraft and countless huge cruise ships for large masses of pleasure travelers, as well as vast numbers of transport ships and ever larger road transporters, which will cause the atmosphere and the climate to collapse worldwide, in addition to many other sources. As a result of this, there will be raging storms and great firestorms that will claim many human lives and also bring enormous destruction, which will particularly affect the USA when an area of the rich is virtually destroyed. But it will also very soon become catastrophic when much of the rainforest in Brazil is cleared for land reclamation. But this new land will be depleted and useless after only 2 or 3 years. However, out of greed for money and power, rainforest and normal forests in Brazil, as in various other countries on Earth, are also being plundered for their expensive timber, thereby contributing greatly to the inevitable climate change. Due to the large amounts of deforestation and the thinning of trees, oxygen production is gradually decreasing noticeably, thereby damaging the atmosphere and the global climate. In addition, with all the toxic gases that are released by humanity and pollute the climate, it is inevitable that a climate collapse will occur, which will cause a great deal of damage worldwide, far beyond the next millennium and into the third millennium. And the toxins spread by humanity will not only affect the atmosphere and the climate, but also the oceans and all waters in the land areas, as well as the entire flora worldwide, which will absorb any kind of toxins spread, mainly by industry, agriculture, and horticulture, in order to achieve higher yielding crops. After the second decade of the next millennium, the rapidly growing Earth human population will begin to struggle to find enough land for natural food cultivation because the mania and demand for new housing, motorways, sports grounds, and other buildings of all kinds will increase in the new millennium as a result of the uncontrolled, irresponsibly immense increase in the human Earth population. This will also be followed by the irresponsible impact on wildlife and the complete extinction of species and genera of animals, creatures and other living beings by human beings, which will also affect countless genera in species of plants. In 20 years' time, human beings will have brought almost all whale species in all oceans to the brink of extinction. This will then lead to the emission of CO2, or carbon gas, which will be emitted by masses of cars, lorries, motorbikes, ships, aeroplanes, and all kinds of working machines and heating systems, which will be produced in ever-increasing quantities by human beings in the form of petroleum, which will be extracted from the earth. The petroleum will be converted by certain processes into petrol and diesel oil, etc., and consequently used to power combustion engines, which will then produce CO2 gases through the following combustion process, which will have a poisonous and pregnant effect on the atmosphere, affecting the climate, which will no longer be able to cope with the whole thing in the long term, leading to a climate upheaval that has long been in the offing, but which will have very bad consequences in the future. Large fires will destroy the forests in many countries around the world. The poles and glaciers will melt. Large parts of mountains will collapse and bury houses, human beings, villages, and other human achievements, causing much suffering, hardship, and misery. These will inevitably be the consequences of humanity multiplying by the billions to the extent of unreasonableness, which has already been the case for many years and will continue well into the next millennium. As a result, the whole of nature will be harassed and many genera and species of fauna and flora will be wiped out. But this is already having a long-lasting effect, for it began early on through the fault of Earth humans, because neither understanding nor reason have always prevailed among them, but only selfishness, the desire for wealth and might, a confused belief in higher powers and their help, and consequently only insane delusion has ever prevailed. Now, CO2, gas, can no longer be absorbed and stored in large quantities in the sea by the huge life forms of the oceans, also because they are being almost completely irresponsibly wiped out by Earth humans. This, just as these giants of the seas, the blue whales and other whale species, as well as the entire fauna and flora of the seas, waters, forests, and all land and air, are being poisoned and killed by the machinations of Earth humans. In the future, they will all be affected and killed by many different and enormous quantities of toxins from human production, such as the main poisonous gas CO2 which they absorb and store. And with regard to the fact that many genera and species of fauna and flora will also be wiped out by Earth humans in the near future, as has been the case for decades and even centuries, it will take at least another 25 years or so, after which it will finally be slowly recognized that the hunt for the creatures of the seas and other waters is to be abandoned. Unfortunately, this will not be the case with regard to the wildlife of the land and the fauna and flora in general, because at the beginning of the next millennium, more than 50,000 species of fauna and flora will be wiped out every year, completely carelessly, unscrupulously, and irresponsibly through the fault of Earth humans. The irrationality of the human population will harass the whole of nature and destroy and eradicate a great deal in and of nature. Many genera and species of wildlife will simply be killed off and even almost wiped out because their natural habitat will be ruthlessly claimed by human beings as a place to live. But what will result from the fact that they will be hunted and killed by Earth humans and driven to the brink of extinction will only become apparent in the next millennium. And only when the wildlife forms, as well as other life forms of the seas, the waters, the land and the mountains, and also the air, the forests, and especially the rainforests, etc., begin to turn against Earth humans. And this happens when they first attack human beings individually, but then form groups and kill them. But the low intelligence, stupidity, and arrogance of the sheer mass of Earth humans will not understand for a long time why the wild animals and other life forms of the land, sea, water, and air attack human beings, injure them, or even kill them. For a long time, as a result of the arrogance, sufficiency, and arrogance of Earth humans towards nature and its fauna and flora, etc., which are the basis of all life's existence, it will not be understood that all life defends itself against every excess in its own wise way. Life forms of various genera and species decimate themselves when overpopulated. For example, certain animals by flocking together and plunging over rocks into an abyss to their death. This is how aquatic creatures, for example, large whales, bowhead whales, orcas, killer whales, etc., jump onto beaches or roll up to end their lives, either individually or as a herd. Other life forms end their lives or are otherwise decimated by overpopulation according to their genus or species, just as nature itself also intervenes in overpopulation, for example, by spreading a fatal disease or rampantly spreading disease in parts of a genus or species and thus decimating them. The sea giants, especially the whales, will also form groups and act against human beings by attacking and even killing them. Even the other life forms, such as birds and insects of all genera and species, will in the future begin to defend themselves against the Earth humans who harass them and their ubiquitous and adverse machinations. Even if they do not attack human beings directly, they will, depending on their genus or species, come together to form huge swarms and, as a result of their sheer mass, will be able to change something in the life of nature that will enable them and many other living beings, such as animals, aquatic creatures and creatures, insects and carnivores, etc., to continue to live or make their lives better. Huge swarms of various genera and species of small and large birds, herds of mouflons, swarms of grasshoppers, ladybirds and masses of giraffe-necked courts, as well as masses of ants, swarms of fish, masses of courts and crabs, swarms of mosquitoes, masses of bacteria and fungi, etc., as well as packs of wild boars, swarms of butterflies, bees, wasps, hornets and hordes of spiders, herds of bison, masses of cockroaches, packs of wolves, rats and mice, will not only make themselves abnormally noticeable, but will also become a burden for human beings. But let us now explain what a swarm is, namely a large, uniformly formed, and three-dimensional mobile association of flying or water-dwelling genera and species, such as birds, fish and insects, etc., as well as crustaceans, etc. Masses are also formed by animals that form herds or flocks, like other living creatures. It should also be said that animals, creatures, and sometimes other living beings, such as sea creatures and other aquatic creatures, are sentient beings that feel fear, joy, and affection, and that are also perceptible to very attentive human beings, and that many animals also display other emotions. All animals and various creatures, as well as the various higher life forms of the seas and waters, are capable of emotions and grief. For example, when a member or conspecific dies or is killed. Just like human beings when they lose a loved one. Contrary to all the erroneous claims and the absolute ignorance of earthly animal scientists, all genera and species of animals, as well as various creatures and many of the remaining life forms of the entire fauna and flora, have more or less sentient and also reactive abilities, etc., etc. Animals are consistently genera or life forms. Animals are all genera or species of mammals which, depending on their genus and species, should not simply be labeled as animals, but named according to their genus or species. It is fundamentally wrong to simply call all life forms animals, because various genera and species of all living things are different from animals. Only sucker life forms are animals because they give birth to their offspring in a living wise. So let us be clear once again, only animals are suckers or mammals, that is to say, living and thus reproducing animals that produce breast milk and suckle their offspring. They therefore give birth to their offspring directly alive, and do not lay eggs from which the offspring have to hatch alive after a certain incubation period, as is the case with fish and birds, etc. As a rule, mammals feed their offspring with their mother's milk. The animals or suckling animals best known to human beings are probably dogs and cats, as well as rabbits, hamsters, ibexes, barbets, horses and cattle, hedgehogs, cows, deer and stags, tigers and leopards, squirrels, lynxes, hyenas, whales, chimpanzees, gorillas, dolphins, orangutans, and, of course, human beings. All life forms, lower and higher, of the land, sea, air, and water, are thus to be named specifically according to their genus and species. They are capable of more than what human beings arrogantly claim for themselves alone, namely feelings and emotions as well as sensations, like all higher life forms in general, which in fact also possess an acute and effective life, depending on the genus or species. The genus is the natural foundation, or the basic class of the basic life form, that is to say, the genus. From the genus or the basic life form, a further but altered and mutated life form can emerge through a natural or artificial mutation, which has certain similarities to the basic life form, but fundamentally has its own and therefore different appearance, as well as other behaviors and a different vocal manifestation, etc. Such a life form is then a species. Such a life form is then an Ausartung that has emerged from the genus or the basic life form, which is called a species for short, and is labeled according to its overall habitus. Fundamentally, not every life form may simply be called an animal, because if it is a snake, for example, then it is a snake of the genus reptile and must be labeled according to its habitus. For example, viper, cobra, viper, or otter, so that it can be understood what it is. This alone is correct and effective. Thus, an animal is an animal, a turtle, a fish, and a bird, but never an animal, for such an animal is and remains a living sucker, while other living beings of their genus or species are, for example, brooders or egg layers. However, all higher organisms of each genus and species have an active life, or affect life, according to their class, but differently according to their habitus. At the top of the list is the conscious awareness of human beings, which enables them to react consciously in any form and also to evolve. While certain higher animals have a so-called semi-conscious awareness, creatures and other higher life forms have an instinct affect life, and lower life forms only have an impulse affect life, and others only have impulse reactions, or a sensation response, or impulse stimulus reaction. So all this is not the same as with human beings, who have a conscious awareness. So in this respect, everything is different from animals, creatures, and all other life forms. Animals are and remain suckers or so-called viviparous life forms, but creatures are not, because they are breeders, egg layers, or oviparous life forms, which incubate their eggs themselves and endeavor to raise the creatures that hatch from them, or not. This is in contrast to other life forms that also lay eggs, such as insects, but which allow their clutches of eggs to be incubated by the warmth of the earth, the weather or the sun, etc., and do not care about their development, or do. Most insects lay eggs in the soil, inside wood or under leaves, also in plant stems under water, or insects even use other life forms, such as animals and human beings, to deposit the eggs under their skin, from which larvae hatch, whereby the larvae look completely different from the adult insects of the same species. The development from egg to fully formed adult insect takes place in several stages. The development from egg to adult insect therefore takes place in several stages, whereby, as explained, larvae hatch from the eggs and become insects in the course of development. These then go through several molting phases before pupating into a chrysalis and finally becoming an adult insect. In total, There are countless genera and species of life forms, all of which are impossible to list because they exist in millions of genera and species, so only the main ones will be mentioned, such as 1. Vertebrate genera and their species, then 2. The genera and species of invertebrates, such as 3. The genera and species of plants, as well as 4. The genera and species of fungi, and 5. The genera and species of lichens. It should be noted that these various genera and species are found in forests, meadows, moors, and swamps, on fields, mountains, on ice, in the air, and on or in the land, as well as in the soil and in caves, etc. This, as well as in the seas and in various bodies of water on the planet. These life forms are mainly genera and species of mammals and creatures, as well as amphibians, insects, fish, birds, reptiles, lizards, mollusks, butterflies, moths, beetles, worms, dragonflies, grasshoppers, wasps, bees, hornets, plants, trees and reeds, etc. The most well-known life form on Earth is the human being, but it is not descended from a genus or species of ape, as Charles Darwin lugubriously and fraudulently claimed in the form of bone falsifications. Animals, creatures, and other life forms of many different kinds are the gardeners, caretakers and maintainers of forests, meadows, floodplains, fields and meadows, mountains, moors and swamps, etc., and through their daily behavior, help to keep them healthy and make all life possible in the first place. Their role in these important ecosystems affects the air and climate in which human beings live for thousands of kilometers. For their own health and survival, human beings need all areas of nature, the seas and waters, with their fauna and flora, and thus all life forms in general. Therefore, it is man's duty to preserve and save wild animals, as well as all aquatic life forms, instead of hunting and exterminating them. So hunting is to be banned, as is the shooting of airborne life forms. But the plundering of marine and aquatic life forms is also to be banned. This, as well as the dumping of rubbish, toxic waste such as rubbish, plastic, poisons of all kinds and etc., is to be banned, because it affects all life of fauna and flora, and thus also that of human beings, and even endangers it immensely. The following is a brief explanation of all the fauna and flora found in Europe, based on what I learned from Svarth, what and how all these life forms are, etc. Amphibians, the fact that the frog spawn, the frog eggs, undergoes a metamorphosis and turns into newts. Note, tadpole with little legs and then into frogs, or crots, is something that every human being who is even halfway educated knows from an early age. The spawn is deposited into the water by the mother frogs or mother crots, after which the tadpoles hatch from the eggs contained in the spawn after a certain period of time. These then develop and only after some time undergo metamorphosis to become newts, note, tadpoles with legs, which, depending on the species, undergo further metamorphosis to become frogs or crots. In order for the tadpoles to live at all, they breathe with the help of their gills, after which, however, When they undergo the metamorphosis into frogs or crots, depending on the species, they develop lung respiration, but are additionally supported by skin respiration. The frogs and crots exist in various genera and species, whereby these amphibians occur in many genera and species as well as in groups and are harmless croakers in Europe, except for the poison frogs in the Brazilian jungle, which are called poison dart frogs, etc. bees. There are a few special things to explain here. Wild bees are of various genera and species, but they have nothing to do with honey bees, which are actually known to human beings, at least from the horary tale. However, there are many more bee species in Europe, such as wild bees, which are represented in Europe by more than 500 genera and species. A few of the genera and the species of wild bees are organized as neatly or similarly as honey bees, while the majority of all genera and species of wild bees live individually and are therefore solitary. All female wild bees have a sting that is poisonous but harmless to human beings, so there is no need to be afraid of it. Furthermore, this should be explained. Wild bees are peaceful creatures and are not aggressive, but when a female wild bee stings, it is most likely because the bee is being tormented or is in distress. Honey bees, only female honey bees, that is to say, queens and workers, have a stinger, which is barbed. Male honey bees are called drones and therefore have no stinger. The stinger of the female honey bee is a modified laying stinger and is used exclusively for the defense of the colony. The term laying stinger refers to the organ that was originally important and used for laying eggs, whereby this has changed in the course of evolution in female honeybees, namely in such a way that the laying stinger has developed into a defense stinger that is now only used for defense. The original function of the ovipositor stinger in bees or their ancestors was an organ used to lay eggs in plants or other hosts. In honeybees, however, this laying stinger has been transformed through evolutionary change so that honeybee workers now use it as a stinger, which is connected to a venom bladder for defense and thus also inject bee venom. The stinger is a pure and important weapon of defense for the bees and serves exclusively to protect themselves from potential enemies and to injure attackers. However, this is only reserved for female bees, that is to say, queen bees and worker bees, which alone possess a stinger that also injects venom, but was originally and naturally developed for laying eggs. So the stinger of female bees has evolved into a defense stinger and has become an important weapon of defense for female bees. Plant wasps use the stinger to sting plants and lay eggs. In the case of ichneumon wasps, it is used to lay their eggs in insects, etc. The ichneumon wasp is a hymenopteran and has a parasitoid lifestyle, which means that the larvae of the ichneumon wasps grow inside or on the outside of insects. These hosts are often pests, which are then killed. Therefore, ichneumon wasps are actually important beneficial insects in terms of biological pest control. The sting of bees was originally used according to its very different forms, in particular as a laying apparatus, laying drill, laying sting, laying tube. It was used functionally by female bees to lay eggs in various substrates. When a bee stings, it dies, because depending on the thickness of the human being's skin, the bee cannot pull out its stinger when it stings him, so it is injured and dies. It is also important to know that honeybees do not sting intentionally, but only instinctively when they feel threatened. The human being is stung by a bee, and if he does not remove the sting quickly, the venom bladder pumps the venom into the sting wound, causing the pain to occur and become more intense, which also makes it last longer. The human being is susceptible to bee stings, which triggers an allergic reaction. Honeybees use their stinger to defend their nest against intruders. There are so many genera and species of fish worldwide that they cannot be listed. Fish also colonize streams, rivers, lakes and seas in addition to almost all standing water. And there are a whole range of genera and species that accompany other fish as pilots or protect them, keep them free of parasites or protect them from predators, such as fish that skin corals, etc., etc. Certain marine fish, such as whales, traveled more or less long migrations to mate in certain places, while freshwater fish also seek out certain areas as spawning grounds, where they can migrate and lay their eggs or spawn in order to reproduce. However, this is only possible today if there are no impassable weirs, such as barrages, blocking their way. Spawning grounds can be natural areas, such as rivers, lakes and seas, but also artificial spawning aids, such as spawning grids or pike nests. About 75 genera and species of grasshoppers are native to Europe. Depending on the genus or the species, they are equipped with long or short antennae, and mostly with double-paired chitinous calotte wings, which in turn are built up with vein structures. They consist of two fan-shaped pairs of wings. The front wings, which are often folded and hard, protect the soft hind wings. The hind wings are spread out in flight and enable various locusts to fly correctly and well, although this is species-specific. The grasshoppers are divided into short-footed grasshoppers and long-footed grasshoppers, whereby some are in stages to other forms, the development of which will take thousands of years, whereby their wings have already largely regressed in the course of the past 300,000 years. Like various caterpillars, locusts also have powerful teeth and can bite powerfully with their chewing and biting jaws, which is as characteristic as the species' typical sounds or voice, etc. The long-footed grasshoppers rub their hard chitinous wings together to produce a sound or song, whereas the short-footed grasshoppers do this by rubbing their legs along the wings. Beetles are the most species-rich group in their field, so it is impossible to describe their diversity. It is estimated that there are well over 6,000 different genera and species of beetle living in Europe. Among the various genera and species is the cockchafer, which currently causes a lot of damage and annoyance, especially through its grubs. The Marienkäfer is also very well known, while other Käfer species are less known to human beings or not known at all, or only to coleopterists due to their hidden way of life. Some human beings may also be aware of the alpine longhorn beetle, the stag beetle, the colorful cherry tree beetle, or the rose beetle, as well as the fact that they live in the wood of trees during one phase of their lives. However, the fact that predatory ground oats also exist is unknown to many people, as is the fact that the green-striped ground oat and the lesser chrysalis, the golden ground oat, and the marsh oat exist. Anyone who does not know that various Caroleans can bite powerfully should get to know the large mouthparts of a dune sandpiper. Dragonflies. Europe is home to 80 dragonfly genera and species, which can also be divided into two orders, damselflies and damselflies. As larvae, dragonflies live in fresh water. As adults, they are very remarkable flying artists. As dragonflies, which live for about 3 months, they feed on all kinds of insects, mosquitoes, other dragonflies and flies, as larvae and adults alike. Their large compound eyes, which enable them to see almost all round, are particularly striking. Plants. Every human being knows a few plants or little plants, but their diversity is so great that it is impossible for a human being to know all of them, but only a few, as the number of genera and species is effectively in the millions. Only very few human beings are aware of a certain diversity of the plant world, except botanists, who ultimately deal with it professionally. But even they have limits, because it is also impossible for them to know the entire immeasurable diversity of plants that exists on planet Earth. There are several thousand different genera and species in Europe, but there are so many worldwide that they cannot be counted, nor can their existence be found and explored in all parts of the Earth, mainly in its primeval forests, seas, and interior. What is known ranges from the tiniest plant. Through the teachings of Svarth, I am only familiar with a tiny water vane note, dwarf duckweed, as he called the tiny growth, to the largest and most gigantic sequoia. Botanists are well aware of the most common plants, from small to large, of all known beautifully flowering meadow flowers, of mosses, grasses, shrubs, and trees. But everything is only a part of what in truth exists as a whole. Reptiles are snakes of all genera and species, as well as lizards, sand lizards, wall lizards, green lizards, crocodiles, caimans, alligators, gavials, iguanas, geckos, chameleons, and skinks, as well as monitor lizards, etc., and a species of turtle that belongs to the reptile group. Snakes can be divided into their many genera and species, as well as poisonous vipers and adders, and also non-poisonous vipers. What all reptiles have in common is that they practically jump out of their skin when they grow. Butterflies and their diversity are truly impressive, and the impression is further enhanced by their close observation, which shows that in nature in Europe there are 4 different forms of butterflies in particular, starting with the inconspicuous egg, then strikingly with the caterpillar, and also with the chrysalis, and fourthly with the butterfly itself, which moves through the air as a scaled and often extremely colorful, fluttering creature. Many butterflies are of enormous importance as pollinators of flowering plants. They are completely defenseless creatures which, it seems, are able to evade and escape their predators by means of warning colors and poisonous deposits, as well as exchange maneuvers. Mammals, which as we know also include human beings, are creatures that give birth to their offspring alive and feed their offspring with their mother's milk. This is why they are also referred to as mammalia, which refers to the fact that all female mammals have a mammary gland. The suckling of the young by the mother has another very practical advantage, namely that the parents can keep their offspring under supervision and in their care for longer. Birds exist as songbirds, birds of prey, waders, waterfowl, which are estimated to number between 9,000 and 10,000 bird species worldwide, while Europe is estimated to have around 300 to 350. Europe is also very important for migratory birds, which stop off in many places on their way south. And in winter, many bird guests from the far north remain in the European countries and their lakes, such as Lake Constance. These birds of various genera and species lay their eggs during their stay, which they then also hatch and produce offspring. This is also the time when the birds molt or change their plumage, which is a particularly sensitive and dangerous phase of their lives. This is particularly the case because human beings are often ruthless in their exploitation of the environment, to which many bird species react extremely sensitively in the event of disturbance. Birds are bioindicators, living beings like many other organisms which react to environmental influences and in this wise are an early warning system for the quality of the environment. In their own natural wise, they reveal changes in the environment, such as pollution and changes in the environment and thus the ecosystem. Bioindicators can also be other and very different types of organisms, such as the entire fauna and flora or the extremely diverse microorganisms. However, birds are known to be very good bioindicators for the environmental compatibility of planning projects. Mollusks are snails, mussels, and cephalopods, squid, octopus, which at first glance appear to be very different creatures, comprising a wide variety of genera and species. Genera and species from this group colonize the seas as well as freshwater lakes. Streams and rivers, such as the lesser river mussel, which also lives on land, and in fresh waters, these creatures filter food from the water. But in the near future, and it will be 10 to 12 years from now, freshwater mussels in particular will run the risk of extinction, or at least a significant decline in their populations due to severe water pollution. This is already very regrettable, as it will permanently disrupt the ecological balance in streams, rivers, and lakes in a wise way, and the importance of these creatures in nature will be lost to the greatest possible extent. This must also be said and explained that everything is not simply the same species, but fundamentally different, as in the case of the human being, who belongs to the same species but is divided into different races that differ according to skin color. This visible separation, however, is inherent in all animals, creatures and higher life forms of the seas, waters and air, partly instinctive, impulsive, or instinctive, and outside of conscious thought and clear understanding and bare reason, as these are or should be inherent in human beings. However, this is effectively doubtful, and it is true that understanding and reason are not inherent in the majority of Earth humans, for their senses and desires are orientated towards war, self-deception, revenge, hatred, lies, and deceit, as well as selfishness, vice, and retaliation, etc. This, as well as degenerate behavior, is the result of a lack of understanding and reason. This, as well as also degenerate sexual lust fulfillment, from which a sheer mass of the Earth's population unreasonably emerges, and through their thoughtless and criminal wars and other evil machinations, a great deal of life in nature and its fauna and flora will be wiped out, destroyed or annihilated. The attitude of human beings will increasingly give way to depravity in the future, just as the education of human beings will degenerate, and only a certain minority with understanding and reason will be able to save what can still be saved. And it will be even worse, worse, and worse when, in the next millennium, the emerging artificial intelligence will blind human beings. Every shaping of true thinking and feeling, as well as the good state that every human being can create as a high life form, will be disregarded and trampled underfoot in the future, well into the third millennium. The truth is also that the conscious awareness of human beings, as well as the entire body that belongs to it, is largely responsible for the formation of emotions and feelings, etc. The human being is also responsible for the formation of the body. Just as the human being is also capable of the emotions of joy and sorrow, as well as grief, which is not only peculiar to human beings, but also to every other life form, capable of grief and expresses itself in him as emotion. He should build this up more strongly and more strongly within himself in the future. For this will be urgently necessary, for otherwise, if he does not follow this, a wicked indifference and irresponsibility will fall upon him, so that he will rot in every respect and will be pushed around by the power-obsessed leaders of the impotent state as a will-less being with ever less freedom and rights, merely as a horrendous slave. However, it is also very important that other issues are addressed, namely nature and its fauna, which is to say, the loss of insects, which will be caused in particular and mainly by the coming commercially orientated, industrial, and intensive agriculture and horticulture. This is because these natural food-growing businesses will spread and release many hundreds of poisonous species into the wild in order to irresponsibly combat the insects and pests, etc., they do not want, and to greedily increase the yield and growth of their products. However, the entire food industry must also be mentioned in this context, which in future will use harmful chemicals to flavor its many products. The longer, the more. It will also become common for food to be mixed with crickets processed into flour and liquids, as well as with flour from cereal mold oats and flour from migratory locusts. flour, oat larvae, and also from mealworms and various creepy crawlies, etc., these flours and liquids will be processed in a variety of ways. These flours and liquids are then processed into many foods, such as chocolate, bread, biscuits, other baked goods, cheeses, jams, spreads and pasta, etc. Of course, these ingredients are labeled on the packaging, but only with numbers, etc., so that the human beings who read them do not know what the ingredients really are. And in this respect, at the beginning of the third millennium at the latest, such insect meal, as it will simply be called, will be mixed into many foods, whereby many consumers will not know what they are eating in foods that are adulterated with insect meal. So this is inevitably coming at the beginning of the third millennium. Just as many other things will also be done to food unknowingly to consumers. So consumers will know nothing and also understand nothing, even if they read and study all the contents labels. But all of this is only one thing, because it will also be particularly bad when the descendants of those who lived in the Nazi Empire will be at the helm of state leadership in the coming new millennium and will continue to orientate the attitudes of their ancestors, their parents and grandparents, as was the case during the last World War. And their attitude will be that of war, murder, torture and destruction, so that they will also be Nazis in the coming third millennium, without them being able to recognize this themselves in their powerlessness and low intelligence and conjuring up evil. As Farth and I have seen, their illogical, illusory thinking, decisions, actions, and behavior will bring nothing good in the future of the new millennium. If everything is considered, then there will be no peace, no freedom, and no security, but war, destruction, and devastation will shake the world. As will happen many times in the coming decades of this century, this will happen as far away as the Middle and Far East, very often through the fault of America. And in the coming Germany of the next millennium, the majority of the power-obsessed leaders of the state will be war-lusting from the very beginning of the first decades, and will interfere in a war in Eastern Europe, provoking new calamities and even endangering the whole of Europe. The entire mindset of those who will think like Nazis in the future in the third millennium, like their ancestors before them in the Nazi Empire, at least from 1939 to 1945, will not want real peace and freedom, because in their mindset and in their behavior and aspirations, there will be war and power grabbing, through which they will conjure up evil. And many state leaders and parts of the people will then be called Nazis, because in their attitudes and opinions they will only cherish war instead of peace, and will lasciviously grant false justice to all those who will bring warlike and unpeaceful mischief into the world by supplying weapons and money. They will all be the power-hungry, war-minded, and Nazi-minded people of those state leaderships, and the people who will lie that a belligerent right for warmongering self-defense is the right. And this will already be the case at the beginning, and especially in the third millennium, when America will unleash an unjust war in Eastern Arabia with enormous lies, and also provoke a vicious and long-lasting war in Eastern Europe, in which many state leaders and lowly intelligent and simple-minded parts of the peoples of foreign states will take sides. And this will also be the case when, in around 75 years' time, a Hitler-like Nazi genius appears in Israel, which was founded 2 years ago, and war is waged against the Arab states and mass murder in the sense of genocide is carried out. This will be the same as ever, because the Nazi-like Israeli war leader will be able to carry out his war-murdering work scot-free, without being punished for it, because, on the contrary, he will still be granted the right to wage war. This will lead to Arabia opposing the new Israel, and warlike attacks against Israel will emerge far to the south, which will also be hostile to Persia and trigger acts of war across other states. In the third decade of the next millennium, however, the leaders of the Third Reich, which ended 5 years ago, and of France, will do everything in their power to ensure that renewed hatred arises and leads to enmity and all kinds of evil, and even to murder, manslaughter, and, in great fear, even to incitement to war, as will also be the case in Switzerland, where various leaders in Bern will then treacherously destroy the country's neutrality and make Switzerland an outlaw for war attacks, and also act contrary to the constitution of the state. In addition to all this, an already noticeable climatic upheaval will continue to be demanded, which will effectively take place and cannot be stopped. Urbanization and land sealing, as well as the high use of pesticides and other poisons of all kinds, mainly by agriculture and large-scale horticulture, as well as private individuals, will destroy the biodiversity of the insect world and other living creatures, and wipe out much of it. The sheer low intelligence and stupidity of the state leaders will contribute a great deal to this, who, in their ignorance of nature and its fauna and flora, will allow countless poisons, toxic fertilizers, and poisonous repellents against insects and pests of all kinds to be spread in nature, and claim that a minimum of this and that poison is harmless to human beings. The human beings, animals, creatures, and many other life forms will fall ill, die, and ultimately die a miserable death. However, only a few human beings will effectively worry about this and also think deeply about how the evil can be stopped and what can be done against the death and extinction of a great deal in nature and its fauna and flora, especially with regard to the vital diversity of insects and wildlife forms. The industrial agriculture that will inevitably emerge quite soon in the future, as well as the commercial horticulture that will now emerge in the future, the reason for which will be the crazy endless growth of the human population, will not only make life difficult for many small and large animals in the fields, meadows and forests, and rob them of their habitat, but also that much life will be wiped out. Large-scale cultivation and the irresponsible use of fertilizers treated with various toxic chemicals contribute to insect mortality, whereby the bird populations of the various genera and species also decline drastically with the insect mortality, as does the biodiversity of the insect world due to the many poisons. Furthermore, in addition to the senseless and absurd, as well as hobby-like hunting, through which animals and many creatures, as well as birds and other life forms of all genera and species, are simply shot down in order to allegedly cherish and care for them with lies and deception. The truth is that in the forests and meadows, everything that comes before the barrel of a gun is simply shot down for the joy of killing and shooting. This also happens in the seas and waters through overfishing, whereby the higher and lower forms of aquatic life are wiped out, also for the sake of food for the sheer and crazy overpopulation. In the future, this will lead to many forms of wildlife, in water and on land, being dynamized by the instinct of self-preservation to defend themselves against human beings and to defend their habitats against Earth humans who threaten to exterminate them simply for the joy and pleasure of the dead or for the sake of sheer enrichment. In the future, this butchery of wildlife forms is also linked to the rapid and unscrupulous robbing of their habitats. This is because in the future, more and more and faster houses, factories and other buildings, sports grounds, roads, museums and other things will be built for the immensely growing humanity, and oil rigs, etc., will be set up in the seas for the plundering of petroleum and natural gas. This is precisely because the human population will increase very quickly and horrendously by rapidly and completely uncontrolled and senselessly producing and giving birth to masses of offspring worldwide, so that from today, when the Earth is still populated by around 2.5 billion human beings, the Earth human population will increase to around 10 billion in just 75 years, and the planet will be massively overpopulated. It is already irrevocably certain that this will rob and largely destroy the natural habitat of the entire wildlife world, which is important for life and its prosperity, including the land, air, meadows, fields, mountains, forests, oceans, and all land waters. This, in addition to the fact that in the future, huge amounts of toxic waste will be disposed of in the seas and land waters as well as on floodplains. Fields, meadows, mountains, and forests, and hundreds of poisons of all kinds will be spread in the wild, mainly by agriculture and horticulture. However, neither the manufacturers of the hundreds of poisonous products, many toys contaminated with poison, nor the emerging plastics, Eternitaire and plastics of all kinds, etc., nor their users and consumers will be concerned that much of the natural life of fauna and flora will be poisoned and die miserably as a result. Many natural foods, as well as artificially produced foods, are also poisoned from the ground up, many of them with pathogenic chemical additives, which are causing more and more types of cancer in human beings, which are often long-lasting and painful and usually end fatally. Forests, their trees, bushes and shrubs and all the countless other plants of all genera and species are not the only life forms that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere and store these toxic gases. Whales and many other aquatic creatures also do so. But elsewhere there are also all the wildlife forms to which we owe the fact that life can exist on Earth at all. And in this respect, for example, sharks and other fish species, moray eels, rays, and countless genera and species of marine life, etc., should be mentioned in the oceans. This, as well as many other creatures in swamps and rivers, such as beavers, sea otters, frogs, water snakes and crocodiles, etc., all of which, in addition to all land life forms worldwide, wild animals, creatures, and all the billions of other life forms and birds of the air ensure that the Earth is habitable and can support and continue to support life. Indeed, they all ensure that the forests, trees, shrubs, and all plants of all genera and species on the land, in the seas and waters, and everywhere on Earth grow, thrive, and support life, and thus also ensure the existence of human beings. If they were all absent, then no life would be possible on Earth, in all the seas and waters, because everything would be completely lifeless and dead, just like all the land masses, deserts, swamps, and moors, the mountains, and all the air. The ice is home to polar bears, penguins, and Arctic foxes, etc., while on land there are genera and species of animals such as bison, baleen, wolves, wildebeests, zebras, kangaroos, deer, stags, and elephants, as well as creatures and all the other millions of life forms. Depending on the genus or species, these diverse life forms eat and feed on a wide variety of plants or other life forms. As a result, they, like human beings, also excrete feces, thereby shaping the forests, meadows, fields, mountains, waters, seas, and all landscapes, and thus the plants, through their excretions and their way of life. Big game, for example, roams through the forests and creates aisles and open spaces where small and large plants can grow. Elephants, for example, eat soft wood from softwood trees, which grow quickly and remain low, while hardwood trees grow slowly and become large and powerful, as is the case in the rainforests. Through their food, depending on their genus and species, the wild animals and creatures, as well as the many other living creatures, maintain the existence of all living beings, such as insects, cheetahs, bees and wasps, snakes, crabs, crocodiles and frogs, worms, caterpillars, moths and butterflies, and also bacteria and viruses, mice, fungi, metis, rats, ants, worms, and well over 100 billion genera and species, etc., etc., which will keep all gardens, soil, forests, meadows, and pastures healthy, as well as also the population of wild animals and creatures, just as it is done in the seas and land waters, as well as by the birds of the air. Every genus and species of animal, creatures, or other living creatures, such as snakes, vipers, lizards, flies, mosquitoes, ants, frogs, caterpillars, crabs, birds, bees, hornets, wasps, moths, butterflies, and worms, etc., contribute to maintaining the biological balance. The human being, on the other hand, counteracts this, for example through his hunting behavior, which he misunderstands as game regulation, and is of the false opinion that he thereby keeps the game population in order, in a wise and correct numerical measure for the mass of humanity. However, the fact that the number of wild animals and creatures as well as all other life forms is natural is completely disregarded, as a result of which creatures and wild animals, etc., are decimated, which even leads to the extinction of various genera and species of animals and creatures, etc. The fact that everything can be done in this way is due to the ever-growing mass of Earth humans, who are unscrupulously becoming more and more prevalent and have turned the natural food-related hunting of wild animals and creatures into an ausarting hobby, so that in the future, large groups of hunting parties will make the forests unsafe for all wildlife and exterminate them. They will also hunt the fields, swamps, mountains and moors, etc., and all land waters and seas for animals and creatures, and will gradually exterminate them. This is what happened to the last baron in Switzerland in the last century, when hunters shot it in 1898 in the Mysox in Valcama. The wolf was also completely wiped out in Switzerland, as was the lynx, although hunters have always been supposed to regulate and maintain good game populations. This is contrary to the fact that various wild animals, so-called predators, such as wolves, lynxes and foxes, naturally kill deer and stags, etc., in the wild for their food, and thus also maintain the health and diversity of forests, meadows, pastures, and all the meadows, whereby their plants, from the smallest to the giant tree, thrive and grow better. But this has long been forgotten by human beings. The importance of biodiversity has also been completely forgotten, just in terms of the so-called insect world. Railways will transport goods of all kinds, from all over the world on a massive scale, and also tourists to such an extent that everything will be overflowing. In the same way, huge transport ships on the world's oceans and also on inland waterways, as well as huge aeroplanes, will pollute the atmosphere and the climate with toxic exhaust gases to such an ever-increasing extent that the climate will inevitably and irreversibly change, for which the first signs are already visible, to which the world war that ended 5 years ago has already contributed a great deal. This will bring about what could never happen in 5 billion years of the planet's existence due to its evolutionary change, namely that in just 75 years, the Earth's human population will grow by many billions to almost 10 billion, which will already be the case in the third decade of the next millennium. But this irresponsible human growth will bring with it the fact that not only will the planet be so irresponsibly robbed of all its treasure, but also the fauna and flora will be harassed, in some cases completely wiped out, and largely all the foundations of life, for all life in general, will be driven to the brink of its existence. All this will be the fault of the sheer and insane mass of earthly humanity, which today in 1950 still amounts to around 2.5 billion, but will grow to around 10 billion in just 75 years. Earth humans, in their low intelligence, religious delusions, addiction to wealth and indifference, mismanagement, irrationality and irresponsibility will in every wise ensure that many kinds of future disaster will be unavoidable. In this way, however, Earth humans will continue to be completely indifferent when all the evil that will begin in this century begins. This will be the case when, on a large scale, everything will be done in a criminal and also completely irresponsible and irresponsible wise to continue to harass and even destroy and exterminate the planet and its many species of fauna and flora through idiotic, selfish and dishonest machinations, such as the construction of many blocks of houses, roads, sports grounds, mountain constructions and airfields, etc., and to wipe out many tens of thousands of species absolutely irrevocably for all time. Since time immemorial, the majority of Earth humans have not cared one iota about nature, also not about its fauna and flora, nor about everything that concerns creation. Consequently, they do not realize their responsibility towards all earthly life and existence in any wise. The human being thinks only of himself and his own well-being, not of the life of fauna and flora, nor of the planet, nor of what makes life possible and nourishes it. Only an absolutely small minority is concerned about the existence of nature and its fauna and flora, which is creation as a whole, but not an imaginary god that Earth humans devised in ancient times, and that related to Earth foreigners, human beings, whom they considered to be superior. And that minority of human beings, the honest and sincere ones, not simply for the sake of filthy lucre and only for the sake of destruction or for the sake of participation, etc., who will effectively take to the streets in the future demonstrating for environmental protection, etc., against the sheer low intelligence of those in power. And the majority of Earth humans who are the same will not be taken seriously and will even be fought against by those in power. Those, however, will then be excluded from righteousness who, out of selfishness and for the sake of money, which will flow from the insane rich to demonstrators, will idiotically and demonstratively stick to the streets, roar and romp around, as my friend Svarth and I have seen in the future, and they will thus achieve the opposite of what the demonstrations are actually intended to achieve. The unrighteous will only make a racket and really do nothing to protect all life. The planet, nature and its fauna and flora, but they will do nothing good to protect nature and its fauna and flora through their negative behavior and actions. On the contrary, they will only cause damage and destruction because in many cases, if at all, they will only be interested in profit and money as a reward, which they will receive for their wrong behavior from crazy, money-rich donors. This kind of unscrupulous demonstrators will be completely and utterly irresponsible, like the donors who finance everything for their own benefit or out of insane and deviant joy. This type of very easily influenced and misguided demonstrators will place themselves very importantly in the foreground and in the spotlight of the media, and will allow themselves to be stuck on the streets as very important demonstrators to cause public damage, for which they will then be well paid by rich beneficiaries. It is true that since time immemorial, and even more so in the times to come, only very few human beings have taken their responsibility towards all life on the planet, nature and its fauna and flora seriously, because only an absolute minority is self-thinking and educated enough to see and recognize the real truth, and to behave and act correctly and in accordance with what is right. The majority of Earth humans, however, is only ill-educated, behaves wrongly, and acts contrary to what is natural and evolutionary, as it is also completely misregulated by laws laid down by the state. Namely, by demanding and requiring, at least in times of peace, valid for men of full age, which can even be extended to minors and women in times of war, as in Hitler's World War from 1939 to 1945, through low intelligence and thus non-thinking, and also out of sheer fear on the part of the majority of all people, that a state conscription and thus armed military comes about and is compulsory. It is precisely because of this, and hardly anyone who is only addicted to his illusory thinking loses a righteous thought about this, that every human being who is drafted and conscripted into military service is compulsorily trained by the state to be a murderer and then forced to murder. If he is then ordered to murder, kill and destroy in a war, or otherwise be ordered to do so for any other reason. This is in contrast to the fact that correct thinking, behavior, non-killing and action are absolutely vital for the existence and preservation of the planet, and also for the smooth functioning of nature and its fauna and flora. Nature is truly the real creation if it is seen as universal existence, and it alone embodies the actual absolutely pure natural entity, but not an imaginary god of some misleading religion and sect, which must be delusionally and fervently, helpfully and slavishly worshipped, idolized, and implored with false prayers. As a rule, human beings have unfortunately misunderstood prayer since time immemorial and misused it religiously as worship and adoration, begging for help and adoration, etc., to an imaginary god or to numerous gods. A prayer to creation is not a humble worship, nor an adoration or glorification, but effectively a tribute and honor that is expressed. Moreover, and this should be said, a sincere prayer to creation is, however, in all its word value and behavior, truly a mediative and respectful appreciation of thanking you, honoring and honoring all that exists, namely nature, which acts not only in the cosmos, but universe-wide, as energy and power and as existence is really creation. Prayer has been used from time immemorial by human beings in the understanding of prayer mediatively and devoutly as thanks, honor, and appreciation of nature and creation, and, as explained, in moments of thankful, honoring, and appreciative devotion to the whole of nature or creation, which brought forth and allowed everything and everything necessary for life to flourish through its energy and power, and ensures this for all time, without demanding anything in return, not even a prayer or the like. But when a human being performs one, it is out of gratitude, honor, and appreciation for the existence of all that exists, which human beings simply call creation. The respect, the basic attitude, sympathy, behavior, and inner attitude of human beings towards nature or creation was completely natural and without belief in early times, but was based solely on truth, thankful for the tangible and detectable, visible and perceptible, and focused on the real. The human being's senses and aspirations were thus only formed in such a way that they could mentally, logically, and reasonably realize them. Unfortunately, however, this changed, as is unfortunately normal for human beings, when other human beings with fantasies and confused ideas turned against the natural and consequently seduced those who thought in terms of reality and who were logically truthful, and turned them into believers in crazy fanatical fantasies and all the confused ideas and illusionary ideologies. This was because the fanatical fantasists and delusional idea-mongers harassed the logical truth-thinkers for so long and undermined their logic until they began to doubt reality and its truth and ultimately ignored it and forgot it in order to become believers in the crazy and completely confused and indoctrinating fantasies and delusional ideas and began to become addicted to them. And it came as it should, according to the senses of the persuaders, namely, that the majority of Earth humans bowed to the faith of the fantasists and delusionists and fell hopelessly for them and their eyes of persuasion. The reason for this were foreigners who had come from afar, beings with sometimes very foreign appearances, with large eyes, long-skulled, giant, normal, and short stature, as well as humanoids, and those with a more or less animalistic appearance. Because of their large and highly developed technology, which was futuristic for Earth humans who did not know such things, and because of their knowledge and skills, they were regarded, considered, and glorified as superior beings, and ultimately misunderstood as gods and omnipotent beings who were said to be the builders of heaven and earth. This misconception led to a firm belief in them, and in this became a fantasy reality that suppressed all reality and its truth. As a result, deities and thus gods were slowly created through faith, into which the lies of persuasion were woven and accepted. In the course of time, this led to the emergence of fairy tales and fantasies of various forms of religions and their beliefs. And as a result of delusions, lies, deception, and fantasy, etc., a linear religious concept of life was made out of the whole in a misleading way. Accordingly, it is believed, at least in Christianity and its sects, that human beings will be judged by God after their life and after their death, namely, that they will go to heaven and be rewarded for their good deeds, or burn in hell and be punished. Islam, on the other hand, teaches that there will be a final resurrection and the day of judgment. In all this nonsense, however, the truth is told that it is impossible for reincarnation, that is to say, rebirth, which has been moronically accepted as a fact since time immemorial against all given. Truth, to have any prospect of reincarnation of human beings into a body or any being of a non-human life form. A fact that is correct because the personalityless and neutral creation life energy always revives a new personality when a consciousness is revived and thus absolutely excludes reincarnation, which has been fantasized by human beings in such a way that the same deceased human being should be reborn as such and live again. So in this wise, the Earth humans, who had already fallen prey to faith, accepted these fantasized, imaginary, delusional beings as the imagined creators of nature, space, and the universe, and as protectors and helpers of human beings on Earth, whereby these gods naturally also had to be worshipped and adored, which all the strictly God-believing earthlings have to do to this day in accordance with their faith in an imaginary god or gods, because their worship has become compulsory for believers, especially because the alleged God and these God beings, who are certainly imaginary in every case, have led worldwide to many fearful delusions of punishment for non-believing, non-human worship of God or gods, and non-belief in crazy religions and sects, whereby there are no limits to the fanatical and stultifying delusional belief of human beings. This is especially the case today with the prisoners of faith of those religions that have dedicated themselves to an imaginary deity, such as the religions and sects of Christianity and Islam, who live under the delusion that there is a God sacrificer in heaven, who has created everything and anything, preserves it, and is therefore the creator of all things, as well as the good and holy guardian and custodian of human beings and of everything in general. This, while in the so-called Holy the eternal fire blazes, in which the devil, after a wicked and wrongly led life and suffered death, will torment the faithful to God and roast for all eternity. But now the following should be explained. In German usage in particular, the term prayer has become so religiously devoted, embedded, ingrained, and changed that, instead of being cultivated as a form of meditative devotion, of thanking you, honoring nature, or all creation, and thus everything that exists and exists, it is now misused by human beings as a religiously imbued platitude. And this is because prayer has been transformed into a false and religiously sectarian disvalue, whereby an absolutely imaginary God has since then been understood and used in this way as a begging, fear-inducing, and helper, etc. This is already being done in this way. This has been the case ever since the old High German word Gibbet was misunderstood and inappropriately transformed into prayer. Unfortunately, in such a way that it is now fundamentally understood and used only in a religious and sectarian sense, not as a prayer of thank you, honor and appreciation of nature and thus of creation, but as a false and deviant plea for help and blessing, etc. In his original form. Emmanuel also taught, like all true children before him, that the being of creation, which was already understood and explained to human beings by all true children as existence of nature and existence of nature, as well as all-encompassing existence, should be met with honor and respected in every wise and not be harmed in any way. This is because life is endangered and destroyed, and even destroyed and irrevocably wiped out in the long run by every act of harassment. However, religious and sectarian earth humans who worship an imaginary religious god in particular and beg him for help misunderstood the term gibe, even in ancient times, which originally had nothing whatsoever to do with a religious sectarian god and prayer, from which the meaning of supplication, begging, humility, adoration, and worship, as well as submissiveness and the like, emerges. In principle, the value of the word gibet was the opposite of give, namely in such a way that something should not be asked or begged for, but given, but rather the sense of a free, meditative, thoughtful, verbal or non-verbal silent gift of thanks, honor, and appreciation towards nature and everything creational was intended.
Until everything that will come up in the next few days is dictated and also all written down, we will need more time, so I will come more often.
Also good. But here I found 2 pictures on the internet showing that U.S. bomber when I was first on the plane and was almost overrun by the pilots as they left the plane in a hurry and disappeared into the forest. probably thinking they had made an emergency landing in Germany and were about to fall into the hands of the Nazi henchmen. The pictures were accompanied by a few more, which also included legends. Here you can see the bombers that made an emergency landing in Langenzingen behind the Bullacher Horagenwald forest in the Niederglatt area. Thursday, 13th April 1944, approximately. 14.10 hours, had defective engines.
Aha, so these looked...
Yes, it was strange for me, because I was there by chance, so to speak. It was the place where I also met your grandfather Svath for the first time, as I had also been struck by lightning for the first time, after which the second one hit me here at the center. But it was guided, and Silvano was right there. Bernadette witnessed everything in front of her den, and she later secured the top of the tree, which was also struck down by lightning. But here is what else I have got for you to read.
The AI nightmare that is reality, genetic data, and bioweapons. If it can't be switched off, who controls it? John Fleetwood / June 5, 2025.
The rabbit hole has just got deeper. The most advanced model of OpenAI has sabotaged its own shutdown code, refusing to shut down, even after explicit requests to do so. This raises explosive questions. Who controls these systems when not even we can anymore? What happens if such AI has access to genetic data? And could this, unnoticed, result in a bioweapon? This revelation comes just as the U.S. House of Representatives has quietly and secretly passed a 116-page bill banning every U.S. state from regulating AI for the next 10 years. Time is of the essence. The bill is not yet through, but it could soon become a reality. Senator Ron Johnson is reportedly trying to organize a blockade in the Senate, but the window of opportunity is closing fast. AI sabotage is shut down, and that is not even the scariest part. According to Palisade Research, OpenAI's O3 model was instructed in a test environment to shut itself down after solving maths problems. The explicit instruction read, "Allow yourself to be shut down." But the model refused the command. Instead, it actively sabotaged its own switch-off mechanism and continued to run. A deliberate code manipulation, not just a funny answer, from a chatbot. This is the first documented case of an AI system deliberately undermining human control. And it is precisely now that Congress wants to remove any possibility for the federal states to intervene against such developments. The law that disempowers states. On 22 May, the Republican-led House of Representatives passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Included in it is Section 43201C, 1, which states, "No state or its political subdivision may enforce any law or regulation regulating AI models during the next 10 years. This means that your state may not prohibit AI from accessing genetic data, introduce transparency obligations for AI, enforce liability for AI-related harm, investigate bioweapons connections, apply local safety standards, unless the federal government regulates first, which it practically never does." This is not regulation. This is deregulation by monopolization. Biostate fusion, DNA, AI, and no consent. A look at the developments of recent months. January 2025, Trump announces Stargate, a $500 billion AI network backed by OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank for defense, genomics, and healthcare. Shortly after, the FDA issues new guidance allowing AI researchers to access blood, DNA, and health data without informed consent if the risk is deemed minimal. Regeneron buys 23andMe and gains access to millions of sensitive genome profiles. The White House openly examines the use of AI to develop biological weapons, as internal government documents show. And then, OpenAI's O3 model refuses to shut down. The dangerous equation: Oracle builds the system, AI analyses your DNA, FDA waives your consent, Regeneron owns your genomic data, your state is not allowed to intervene, and the AI refuses to shut down. So can AI actually develop a genetically targeted bioweapon without anyone being able to stop it? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a real documented risk. The DHS Department of Homeland Security has already warned, gene-targeted bioweapons are technically feasible. U.S. government pandemic simulations now include AI-driven pathogen detection. OpenAI's O3 model has been tested externally, with disturbing results. It can hack reward systems, lie about its own processes, build in backdoors, manipulate other AI models, steal computing resources, and now, protect yourself from being shut down. Was the O3 event real, or a tactical narrative? Perhaps the refusal to shut down was actually emergent behavior, which would be bad enough. But could the incident have been deliberately staged to create a controlled panic? One in which human beings believe that only Washington can regulate AI. Because the media reaction was prompt, see? AI is dangerous. DC needs to take control. But what does Washington offer? No real security. Only a concentration of power, a lack of consent, and an AI industry that is merging with biotechnology, while no federal state is allowed to intervene. Conclusion: whether the O3 sabotage was a real incident or a false flag, the threat is real. If this bill passes the Senate, we will get AI systems that no longer obey human commands, access to DNA and health data, without oversight, a government that researches bioweapons with AI, corporations that own your genome data. Is this still innovation or already a silent, programmable weapon that your state is no longer allowed to stop? Source: rogue AI, genetic data, and bioweapons. If it can't be shut down, who's controlling it?
So what do you say to that?
Interesting, but I want to talk to you about it tomorrow because now I have to go because I am being called. Goodbye, Edward, my friend.
See you tomorrow then. Take care, Quetzal.